If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. Believers and skeptics, what was your most terrifying and scariest paranormal encounter that changed your view on the supernatural? My paranormal experiences from Mount Zion National Park made me believe. When I was 17, my father enrolled me in a wilderness therapy program in southern Utah. The program I attended, Wingate Wilderness Therapy, was located in the town of Kanab in the lower part of southern Utah. Overall, the program was excellent, but during my first few weeks, I felt tempted to flee due to my Michigan background, a decision that now seems illogical. However, during my second week, on a Friday, as we prepared to set up camp for the weekend on the low mountains in the upper fields known as the Whites, I recall deciding to run for the last time. I made it down this small dirt access trail along the side of the mountain, going down on a curve. The first thing I noticed before I came around one bend was how quick it was starting to get dark around me. And when I came around this one bend, I remember about 45 yards or 40 yards away was this 6 or 9 tall black mass that had the muscular and skinny kind of build. I couldn't make out what it was at all, but I remember instantly feeling on edge and nervous. I yelled at it, asking who it was and what it wanted, but it never moved at all. By that point, I remembered how dark it was nearly all around me, and I started hearing footsteps run down from up around the bend I came from. I looked back real quick and couldn't see anything. I remembered quickly turning back to whatever was down the road in front of me, and it was gone. By that point, I could only see an arm length in front of me. But I remember hearing those footsteps still running down towards me from where I'd come. I started yelling who was there, who are you, what do you want, and started hearing someone call my name and yell for me and ask if anyone's was out there. I remember answering and saying yes, I'm here, who are you, but the person didn't hear me for about 20 yards, it seemed away in the dark. I heard the footsteps get about 3 steps away before they stopped, and the dude asked, is anyone there? I responded to him, explaining that he was a camp guide from a program at another camp I had previously run past. He was on his way to find me. I asked him multiple times if he heard me responding to him about 50 years away or 30 years ago, and he said no, I never heard you, not till I got super close, and at that point I just broke down. I have no idea what I saw, and I just felt so vulnerable and scared. And just in an instant after he told me he couldn't hear me. I also remember 2 additional staff members that were driving water trucks pulled up, and this dude Andrew that drove one wore this huge deer antler necklace and ghost beads, which are dried up Junie berries, but he confirmed almost for sure that he'd met a skinwalker and told me some of his stories, which is why he wore the necklaces. It's not scary, but I don't know. Weird. When my parents moved to a small town, my mom was too busy to deal with me fighting with my sisters all day. She signed me up for a program for kids my age. Early each day, I would ride a bus to a park in the center of another town. We did activities designed to learn and keep us active. It was a way to dump kids all day away from home. I had hay fever bad. They made me sit on a park bench all day alone. Often they left the park, and I was alone all day. There was this little girl, about 6, who played with the other kids in the park. She seemed the odd kid out. She would come over and talk to me. She talked super kid stuff. Soon she spent the whole day with me. Her father would show up, and he was this tall, thin, austere man. He seems to look down at me and his daughter like we are silly. I was 9, she was maybe 6. We were silly. Anyways, he brought his daughter lunch and me a cupcake. He asked me, is reading one of your skills? I said, yeah. He handed me a bottle. It was hay fever medicine. He asked me, how many pills do you take? I replied, 1 for people under 12. He said, good, you're not helpless. That's how I spent my summer. The girl often wanted to do something, and we did it. We looked at buildings. We spent many hours at the library. We snuck into the high school. A few times we went to the movies. Her father paid and gave us money for ice cream afterwards. The movies were never kid movies. She said, my father lets me watch scary movies. I doubted that. She clutched my hand during the scary parts. On the last day, I said goodbye. Her father thanked me, and the kids said bye without looking at me. That's how I spent my 9th summer. Decades later, my mom died, and my father sold the house. I drove through that town with the park. The park seemed the same from what I remembered. I met the little girl and her father again. They hadn't changed and didn't look like ghosts. The father dressed the same. A suit not suited for the weather. The girl wore pants and a t-shirt with a cartoon on it. She had a backpack. The father said, you look well, but he didn't say much. The little girl asked dozens of questions. Did I get married? No. What did I do? Nothing important. Do I have friends? A few. She finally ran out of questions, and the father shook my hand. He said, I hope life treats you well. The girl ran up and put her arms up. She wanted a hug. I went down on one knee, and she gave me a hug. She said, I'm sorry, I wasn't nice before. I said, that's okay, I didn't mind. I said I had a long drive and had to leave. The father asked my mailing address. He never wrote. That's it. Nothing more. I wanted to share this strange experience my husband had. My husband is not someone who believes in the paranormal and is 100% skeptic. This was a night when I had fallen asleep on the couch and he was up playing video games. He woke me up to tell me his experience, and it gave me chills. We live in a small town, and it gets very quiet at night. We are also about half an hour away from a reserve. We have a 6-foot fence, and our back door directly faces our fence. He decided he would go for a smoke. On this quiet night, it was about 11:30, and he was smoking at the back door. He heard something with dog tags walking behind the fence. He thought, maybe it's just a dog, and whistled. This dog then poked its head over our 6-foot fence and stared directly at my husband. He, in horror, stared at this dog looking over the fence and described how its face morphed from looking like a dog to looking like something inhuman. After a minute, but what felt like an eternity to him, it jumped down and proceeded to cross the road behind our house. He said it was the size of a border collie, and once it hit the tall grass, it disappeared. I'll never forget him waking me up and telling me that he just encountered a skinwalker. I told him afterwards that the 2 rules with skinwalkers are, 1. You never whistle. And 2. You didn't see anything. He was very shaken up after I told him this, knowing he whistled at this dog that looked over the fence at him. I've always been skeptical of the paranormal, but something happened to my wife and me a few years back. For starters, I've experienced some strange sleep paralysis hallucinations over the years, but this time it was different. I woke up unable to move, and there was a woman dressed in very old, early 1800s, attire hovering over me. She had long hair and was maybe a foot higher than me. I could also see a man dressed similarly standing in the doorway of my bedroom watching. I think maybe she hovered over my wife too, but I can't 100% remember. It lasted 20 to 30 seconds, and then I woke up. I assumed it was sleep paralysis, as I get it maybe once or twice a year, but this was much more realistic. My wife was 7 months pregnant at the time and working early mornings at a bakery. I didn't wake her up to tell her about it, and she was gone before I woke up for the day. When she got home, I didn't even have the chance to tell her about it before she said something along the lines of I had the craziest dream last night that an old-fashioned couple was in our room and the wife was hovering over you, with her hair down blocking my face. I couldn't believe it, because there's no way she could have known about it. Just curious if anyone else has had a similar experience? I can't explain it in any way. It hasn't happened again since, almost 3 years later. Over the course of 2 weeks, my husband and I both saw a shadow person in our bedroom. I first saw it while I was sitting in my living room. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, and the bedroom door was open. I saw a hunched-over figure moving from near the center of the door to the right. It appeared to be wearing something draped or a shawl. A few days later, I literally ran into the bedroom to put clothes in a hamper, and I saw the completely black head and torso of someone in front of my closet. I almost ran into it, and it moved backwards to avoid me, then disappeared. A week later, my husband was getting up for work around 5:30 a.m., and as he was putting his shoes on in the dark, he saw a pair of pitch black legs, no torso, head, or arms, appear next to him. He freaked out and tried to quickly walk past them and out of the room, and he saw them back into a corner and disappear. I was half awake and heard a bag on the floor crumple in the corner as my husband left the room, right in the spot where my husband said he saw the legs back up. I've seen a lot of paranormal things in my life, but the shadow person only showing the top or bottom half of their body was pretty strange. I lived in a small village of about 140 inhabitants. It was the beginning of summer. In the same street as I lived in, about 100 meters from my house was my stepfather's parents' house, and next to it was the former house of my SF's great-parents, who by the time this story happened were long dead, meaning this house had since been inhabited by various people. During the summer of 2013, the house was owned by an old man, in his late 60s or early 70s, who arrived here about a year ago. Let's call him Mr. G, he was a kind guy. Anyway, during the summers he would go back to Croatia to visit his family. As such, he asked my family, whom he became good friends with, to watch his house while he was gone. So I would spend my time at his house watching over it. This house was pretty nice, but I always felt a weird feeling at night. Like, something was off. But I used to not think too much of it. One night, I was about to go back home, but before leaving, I had to go to the bathroom. Now, there were 3 bathrooms in this house. 1 on the first floor, and 2 on the second floor. The first one had spiders in it, and my arachnophobic ass wasn't about to take a shit in it, so I decided to go upstairs. The second floor was composed of 4 rooms, 2 bathrooms, and 2 toilets, divided as such: 1 room, 1 toilet, 1 bathroom, and another room on each side of the floor. I used the toilet on the left side because the one on the right lacked light. The doors were open, which gave off a bit of a creepy vibe as it was pitch black, but anyway, I go to the bathroom, close the door, and do my business. As I opened the door though, right across me in the other toilets, I saw a face, as if it were put on the toilet, like the decapitated face of a woman, smiling. I'm scared to death, so I live in a hurry. I leave my computer there, I didn't even switch off the lights, I just run out of there. Now, remember that I said that the house had multiple inhabitants that followed after my stepfather's great-grandparents' deaths? Well, before Mr. G arrived, there was a family of 5, a couple and their 2 children, with the third one born not long after they arrived. They were there for about 2 years but left after the death of the mother. From what I understand, the father had a night job, and one night, the mother had a terrible headache but didn't have any medicine on hand. So she went to their neighbors, the parents of my stepfather, for help, as the headache was literally unbearable, only to die on their doorstep from a ruptured aneurysm in the brain. After that, they left, and Mr. G arrived shortly thereafter. Also, my stepfather's great-grandfather died in this house, and, soon after, his great-grandmother died by jumping in the well at the crossing of the street, 20 meters from the house. Since then, I wonder if I saw the head of the woman who died or my stepfather's great-grandmother. This really happened. Believe it or not. As long as I can remember, I've always enjoyed learning about history, including military history. My dad gave me a copy of Time Life's The Civil War, Gettysburg when I was an early teenager. I looked through it and read it constantly. I found a photo of a deceased soldier at Devil's Den particularly captivating. I never forgot it. Fast forward about 20 years. My wife and I decide to finally visit Gettysburg on Halloween for our wedding anniversary. My first stop had to be Devil's Den. The Gettysburg Military Park has tons of one-way little roads. The road towards Devil's Den had a few. We missed a turn or something, and we got lost. It was approaching evening but not dark. It was overcast with a little drizzle. And my wife and I were hungry. So we decided to come back tomorrow. Driving back into town, I pulled up to a deserted road that was also a 4-way stop. This is where we saw it. Sitting at the stop sign, I automatically looked to make sure it was clear to drive off. As I was about to pull away, I saw something to my left that was probably close enough to reach out and touch. There, floating midair about torso height, was what looked like a cotton button shirt that I believe was dark gray. It was torn to pieces and fluttering violently as though hurricane winds were blowing. I don't remember sounds or smells. There was no blood, and I don't recall seeing any body parts. This shirt is all. My brain didn't, or couldn't, register what it was seeing. I looked at this apparition for about 10 seconds, then drove off. A moment after that, I turned to my wife without saying a word. She was smiling at me and asked, "Did you see it?" Every word of this is true, and the event took place. There is no mistaking what my wife and I saw for anything other than what it was. I'm a 40-year-old married father of 3 great kids. I've never had any encounters with the paranormal before, and I've been skeptical until now. We recently moved to the UK to live in a gorgeous house in an area we love. On one of the first nights in the new place, I awoke to see a tall man standing at my wife's side of the bed staring down at us. It was so real that I honestly thought someone had broken into the place, but oddly, I just stared back in total confusion, unable, or unwilling, to say anything for what felt like a couple of minutes, though was probably much less, before he disappeared. I've since heard footsteps upstairs when no one else is home, seen figures walking into rooms, as if just turning the corner into the room when I see them. The last time it happened I followed it into the room talking to it, annoyed thinking it was my wife and she was ignoring my question, only to find the room empty and my wife downstairs. Outside of the time of these occurrences happening, I haven't really thought much about it, easily dismissing it as nothing, and I haven't talked about it with anyone in any sort of detail. However, earlier this morning, my son came running into my room, saying he saw a tall monster with long fingernails and toenails and a long tongue that was trying to taste him. He has never said anything like this before and is never afraid to be on his own. I've also never mentioned any details or even anything about what I saw to him, or anyone else for that matter. Does anyone know anything about something like this? Growing up, I always believed in ghosts. But I will say I had a bit of skepticism since I've never seen, heard, or experienced anything paranormal. That changed though. What happened made me believe in ghosts, the paranormal, etc. What I experienced is a little difficult to understand. Here is my story. I was in high school, and I grew up in a fairly big house in a small town, nothing special or spooky about it. One day I was cooking breakfast. I remember having my back turned against my living room. It was an older type living room that sunk down 2 steps. Anyways, I was cooking eggs, and my sister was eating cereal on our counter facing my side. From the corner of my eye, I see a dark shadow no more than 5 feet tall run/move quickly from our living room up the 2 steps towards my back. It even made the sound as if someone was running. I freaked out. I turned to look at my sister, and her eyes and jaw were wide open. She says, "Did you see that? It ran up right behind you." I told her that I had seen and heard it. Now here is where my mind gets blown. Normally one person sees and hears something like this. It could be our imagination, perhaps a hallucination, or something with an explanation. But the fact that my sister saw and heard this shadow/ghost, whatever it was, at the same time I did, really solidified the fact, at least for me, that there is something among us. Last week I spent 5 days with my ex. I had lived with him and his mom for over a year and also worked with her. We were pretty close, and she passed unexpectedly in her bedroom a week or so after I had left him and moved out. The first things I experienced were things going missing. Some of this I can explain, but some I just can't. For example, my phone went missing when no one else was in the house but us. We didn't leave the house that night, and we never found my phone. It was just gone. Another thing that I, him, and his sister all witnessed was a pack of cigarettes disappearing and then reappearing on his bed several minutes later after we all had searched there several times. Shit like this happened almost every day I was there. Honestly, I thought I was crazy at one point. Next is the change in vibes. I had never felt scared in that house before. Any time I was left alone last week, I was terrified and paranoid as hell that something was about to go down. That feeling never left the entire time I was there, and Friday morning the house ended up getting raided. I won't get into that, but God, that feeling that shit was about to go down constantly did not fade. I don't know if the feeling was a warning or what. No idea. My main experience was very odd and scared me to death. I had been in his bedroom cleaning, and my ex was upstairs in the bathroom for a while. Hess very loud, and he had not come downstairs for a long time. I know this for a fact. One of his friends was out in his garage, and I also know for a fact that he was not in the house when this occurred. So the bedroom door is set into the wall, sort of shitty, and between the wall and the door is a fairly large crack you can see into the living room through. Lights were on in both rooms when this occurred. So as I was cleaning, I suddenly felt like someone was standing outside the bedroom door. The feeling was almost unbearable, as I knew no one was out there. I ignored it though. A few minutes later, I happened to look at the door, and I can see through the crack very clearly. I see someone sitting on the floor in the living room, angled left half facing the door. I can see their faces so clearly that I see their glasses. The person looked similar to my ex but off somehow. They were looking down as if they were looking at a phone. I take a step back and open the door, and ducking no one was out there. I immediately walked upstairs to my ex and asked if he had been downstairs recently, and he said no, and I told him what happened. Later, my ex-friend came inside, and I told him what happened. He told me that when he slept on the couch when he was crashing there were a few times he woke up to go pee or go to the kitchen and swore he saw my ex-mom standing in the dark upstairs or in the kitchen. I cannot see her doing that. I don't know if what he saw was really her. It terrifies me. A few days later I told my ex-sister what happened, and she said one day she heard her mom's voice yelling and asking her a question, but she couldn't make out what she said. I have massive goosebumps and tears telling this story. I've had several experiences throughout my life and had recently been thinking it had been a while since I experienced something like this. My great-grandfather homesteaded in Alaska before all the housing developments and heavy traffic. Used to be a really quiet area, very swampy, and super cold in winter. You'd walk through the swamp and hit patches not quite frozen all the way through, even in the deepest part of winter. Now, that in and of itself isn't unusual. Running water doesn't always freeze. It's a geologically active area, there's reasons for that. However, my great-grandfather spent time in Ireland before settling in Alaska, and he liked to tell how when he was there he rescued a pair of fairies and made a pact with them. In exchange for being able to see things nobody else could, he'd take them with him and provide alcohol to their liking. When he settled in the homestead, so he liked to tell it, he brought the fairies with him. So long as they had a drop of alcohol and good company in the cold of winter, there they'd stay. Now, we did see them on occasion at the swamp. Not just us kids, but the adults, too. They looked like fireflies, or balls of light, mostly in white, but you'd see one in red or blue, now and again. Not like, slightly red, or somewhat blue. Like red M&M or blue M&M but glowing typed red or blue. They were also seen inside the cabin. Sometimes they'd follow you, or all collect nearby while we were chopping firewood, but not always. The red one was almost always around when someone got hurt, and we were all fairly convinced it made bad things happen. I'm not sure if people outside our family saw them, but I do know everyone within my immediate family had at least a handful of direct experience with them and at least one negative experience with the red light, or fairy, as my family always called it, present. The cabin had a sort of lodge-style design. The rooms were lofted and to either side of the living room, kind of like in hotels, where there's an open middle section, banisters surrounding it, with rooms on opposite sides. It doesn't really matter, except that from upstairs you could see either side of the wall dividing the kitchen and sun room, and on more than one occasion you'd see the little balls of light would hit the wall and just keep going out the other side. You'd also hear whistling, sometimes, kind of an echo of what my great-grandfather sounded like when he was drinking and, as he liked to say, chatting with the fairies in his putter room. It would happen when you were in the swamp and in the house, and when you were the only one on the property at all. The homestead burned down shortly after my great-grandfather passed away, maybe 7 years ago, and so far, nobody's in a hurry to rebuild. I do wonder sometimes if the lights are still out there or if there is whistling, but I'm not in a rush to find out. This story happened to me when I was in middle school, and I will never forget it. I thought this was the perfect community to share my experience. Here's some background. This took place around the time I was 11 to 13 years old in my mom's boyfriend's townhome. I am now 25. Both my mother and I had experienced many unnerving moments in that house. We are both sensitive, while her boyfriend was skeptical. Some of my own experiences there include books falling from my bookshelf, never being able to sleep with the light off due to the overwhelming sense of fear, hangers being flung from the closet, and some of the worst episodes of sleep paralysis I have ever had. Even to this day, one night, which I will never forget, led me to sleep in my mother's bed for the first time in years. I had an episode of sleep paralysis where two pairs of eyes flashed in front of me, while my own were closed, and something crawled up from under my bed, laid on my side, and breathed in my ear. I could not move or open my eyes, and nothing came out when I tried to scream. I will never forget that night, and I have not experienced a worse episode since. I was interested in drawing, and one day I drew a demon girl, which I had never done before or drawn since. Very out of character for me. I hung it up outside of my bedroom door, and my mom removed it from the home and burned it because she was so horrified by what she had experienced there. Alright, onto the story. One night, during the week, my mom and her then boyfriend were going to be out of town. I had school the next day, so my mom had asked her sister Jay and her boyfriend, now husband, M, to babysit me and make sure I got to school alright. The night itself was relatively normal, and we soon all went to bed. Luckily, I slept through the whole thing, but my aunt and mom relayed to me what happened next. My Aunt Jay said that she and M are laying awake in my mom's bed for the night on the second floor. They were just about to fall asleep when they were absolutely horrified by what they described as the clearest, loudest woman's scream they had ever heard coming from the bottom of the stairs. They were so freaked out and were frozen for a few moments while they looked at each other to confirm what they had just heard. Jay got up to check on me across the hall and said that I was sound asleep, with the light on, of course, and when she looked over the second floor landing, she, of course, saw absolutely no one there. The next afternoon, when my mom and her boyfriend returned home, my mom asked, Jay, so, how did it go? Did you hear anything? My aunt was absolutely terrified and was not happy that my mom knew that something was going on and still asked her to watch me. To this day, my aunt and M will assert that they know what they heard, and they refuse to ever babysit me or spend the night again. Luckily, we only lived in that house for 3 to 4 years. Once my mom and I moved out, we still had some unexplainable experiences, but never to that same degree. There was definitely something in that townhome. When I was about 8 or 9, I visited my relative's apartment with my mom. My father bought me a cute doll from overseas, and I wanted to show it to everyone in that household. While my mom was talking to the relatives, I decided to visit their neighbor's apartment. I knew them well, having visited their house many times. I went to that apartment and greeted some family members sitting in the living room. I then took the stairs to go to the upper floor. I remember the upper floor was dark, and the only light was coming from the veranda. I saw 2 family members sitting and talking. I went to them, showed them my doll, and walked back to the dark hallway to reach the stairs that would take me back to the first floor. That's when I saw a woman walk into the room at the end of the hallway. From the back, she looked so much like one of the women who lived in that flat. I thought of following her into the room to show her my doll. Before I entered that room, I became frightened for some reason. Part of the reason may be because the room was pitch black, and I was confused why she wouldn't turn on the light. I was worried she'd hide in a corner, trying to jump at me in the dark. So I decided not to go into the room and went downstairs, only to find that woman in the kitchen on the first floor. I didn't see her on my way in, but she had been downstairs all along. I told her what I saw upstairs, and she exchanged a funny look with another family member there and just brushed me off. By the way, there were no guests in the house. I don't know who I saw. Later, I told my mom about it. She also brushed it off, but I later overheard her talking to my dad about some strange things going on in that apartment after they brought in a harp-like musical instrument. My mom said they would hear someone playing the harp at night, and when they checked, the sound would stop. I have been intrigued by mimic stories, especially because of this childhood experience. This is the one and only encounter I have with anything paranormal. From where I come from, there are beliefs and warnings about mimics. For example, hikers and hunters are told not to call each other by their real names, as mimics can lure them to make them lost by calling their names in the voice of someone they know. They could also trick you by looking like your friends and making you follow them. My dad experienced the legendary Mexican ghost nurse La Planchada, the Iron Lady, as in with perfect clothes. I don't remember exact details, but before my dad passed away, he would tell us about the time he was saved by her. Before my dad met my mom back in Mexico, this was around the 70-80s, my dad got incredibly sick to the point he was hospitalized with an intense fever that had been there for days. Since he used to live in Guerrero, they weren't anywhere close to a hospital, so they held off taking him until he was at death's door. When he was in the hospital, doctors did their thing, I don't know the specifics, I forgot, and eventually retired for the night. Since it was a general hospital, he was in a room where it was separated using just the curtains to create pseudo rooms, sort of like emergency centers in the US but with no walls. He has his curtain open all the way since there weren't any patients in the room/hall he was in. He told us he specifically remembers feeling like he was going to die, calling out for nurses since it got to the point where he was passing out. No one answered his call, which is not uncommon in Mexican hospitals at that time. At this point, it's very much into what my dad felt. He told us he remembers getting a distinct feeling as if his skin was slowly drifting away from the heat he felt from the fever. A nurse finally came by, wearing all white and with her clothes perfect without a single fold on them. He tended to my dad and even gave him some medication. The day after, he woke up a lot better, still sick but no longer passing out and having his fever rescind a little. He talked to the doctor that came in the morning and asked that he wanted to thank the nurse working the night because he believed she saved him. The doctor informed him that there was only a handful of nurses in the building at the time and that no such person worked there. My dad took it as strange but didn't investigate with the doctor any further and decided to ask a nurse. The nurse also said the same thing, no one she knew fit that description. After he left the hospital, after a few days, he was good as new, but he always remembered that same lady that saved his life. He told his story to his dad, who told him about the legend of the Planchada, or Iron Lady, and how she saves people that need her in hospitals. Because he was Mexican and superstitious, he left it at that. I always believed he was telling the truth, my dad, but I hadn't really looked into it until my mom remembered about the incident a few days ago. Like I said, my dad is no longer with us, and from time to time we talk about the stories of his life and his experiences, so I googled it, and it surprised me how this isn't an isolated incident and how there's a very interesting background to the nurse. She's sort of like a Mexican guardian angel. If you've never heard of the Scole report and the Scole experiment, it was a years-long series of attempts to communicate with the other side, now documented in 2 books that can just scratch the surface. For years they had almost no results, then the floodgates opened and some of the most amazing things happened. They did all they could to make their work as fake-proof as possible. For example, working in a closed basement room with only one way in/out, I believe windowless, with every nook and cranny checked before each session. They invited skeptics and paranormal investigators, and none of them were able to identify how they could have produced the results they got, unless of course they just made up things not supported by the eyewitnesses. So what happened? Disembodied voices, full-body apparitions, floating lights moving with apparent intelligence, messages appearing on photographic film, secured in locked boxes, and apports, solid objects that materialized. One of them, in my opinion, cannot be debunked unless you ignore the facts, which were independently verified. A newspaper materialized. It was a story related to one of the spirits they communicated with. It was dated from the 40s, but it was as fresh as if it were printed that day, no yellowing. They had the newspaper analyzed. The paper and the ink and the typography all checked to be from the correct time period, all of which were special because of the war effort causing them to substitute certain products. There is no way a paper from that era would not have aged or yellowed in that amount of time, even if it were kept in archival conditions. And aside from the personal significance, there was nothing special about that issue that would have warranted keeping it in pristine condition for 50 years only to bring it to some random basement in a small English town. They checked with every possible source that might have had a copy of that paper, and none of them were missing. One interesting conundrum was that their copy was slightly different from others they found, but it could be chalked up to the fact that in those days it was common to run several pressings with small changes as the news updated. The room had been checked before the session as usual, and no one got up or came in once it got underway. There was simply no explanation other than that the paper had materialized in the room. For some reason unknown to me, they were often unable to get definite answers to how the spirits did this or where the paper had been all this time. But the newspaper still exists, and since its materialization, it has aged and yellowed normally. This happened to a family friend, the Salazars, in my husband's, Jim, family. Jim and my in-laws were so close with the Salazars that they ended up being one of the principal sponsors, godfather and godmother, at our wedding. My husband grew up in an exclusive village in their little hometown. The village was situated at the back of a big warehouse and had decently gated middle-class family homes in it. To this day, the tiny village only consists of 10 houses. The 3 houses on the left side of the village have larger lots, while the rest of the houses were cramped up on the right side of the village. A 2-way road separates both sides, and on the end of this road is a dead end. The Salazars' property is one of the 3 big lots on the left, while Jim's is on the right, just adjacent to the Salazars. The sides of the warehouse served as their village's right-of-way. Facing the warehouse, the left side would be the entrance to the village, and the right side would be the exit. Jim's family are dog lovers, so they had a few at that time. The Salazars have trees on their lot, and a huge one was growing in their front yard. He told me that back when they were younger, at least 3 times a week, their dogs, along with other neighborhood dogs, would suddenly stare at this tree and would growl, bark, and howl like crazy. They would then shoo the dogs away just to stop them from making a lot of noise. The Salazars have 2 boys, who were just around the same age as Jim's and his older brother. Mrs. Salazar is a tall, on the heavier side woman, while the husband, Mr. Salazar, was on the shorter side. So when this incident happened, the authorities and the whole neighborhood were baffled. One day, Mr. Salazar woke up only to find his wife, Mrs. Salazar, laying on the floor bleeding and badly injured. Their bedroom was a total wreck. Broken glass everywhere. Huge cracks were visible on the higher part of their bedroom wall and scratch marks on their wooden floors. He immediately called for an ambulance, and Mrs. Salazar was then rushed to the hospital. Mr. Salazar then called the authorities to have the incident investigated, thinking that they may have been burglarized and someone might have assaulted his wife. When Mrs. Salazar gained consciousness, the authorities immediately talked to her, and they were speechless. Mrs. Salazar told them that she suddenly woke up in the middle of the night because the dogs were barking like crazy. While lying on her back, she then sees this huge thing with glaring red eyes and skin as black as a shadow, standing at the foot of their bed, grinning widely at her from ear to ear. The creature's head was slowly bending from side to side. The thing then suddenly gripped her ankles and quickly pulled her down towards it. She landed so hard on the floor. The creature then let out a loud, diabolical laugh. She then screamed for her husband, asking for help, but it seemed that he couldn't hear her. The thing then dragged her across the floor, and she broke a few of her nails trying to grab at something. It then threw her so hard at the wall that it cracked and chipped some of the concrete from it. She fell to the floor. It then picked her up again and smashed her to the ceiling and crashed their bedroom light fixture. She felt some broken glass piercing her back. She then fell to the ground, and just before losing consciousness, she saw Mr. Salazar turning on their bedside lamp, calling her name, and running towards her. There were no signs of force entry as to why Mr. Salazar at this time has become a person of interest. But the authorities cannot explain the damages at the crime scene, though. It was a miracle that Mrs. Salazar was still alive despite the injuries she suffered. Mr. Salazar was obviously thoroughly scanned for scars or bruising. His knuckles, bottom of his feet, etc., but no visible proof was found to prove that he was the one who inflicted his wife's injuries. Their 2 boys also stated that they didn't hear anything at all. Jim's family was also interviewed by the authorities, stating that all they heard was the dogs were barking like crazy. The rest of the neighbors said the same. The Salazars then hired a shaman to purify their property. They later found out that the thing lives on that huge tree in their front yard, and it got mad when it found out that Mrs. Salazar was planning to maximize their front yard and remove the tree's home permanently. Up to this day, the tree is still there, and so are the Salazars. The incident never happened again, as per their account. But the place surely gives me the creeps every time we come to visit Jim's parents. After all this, I'm still a skeptic, trying to find a logical explanation for all these occurrences, but nothing covers all the bases. I was 8 to 9, living with my parents in a duplex in the Midwest. Lots of weird occurrences happened in my bedroom specifically, like my closet door shutting on its own once, for example. That door was always tricky to close since my floor was carpeted and the door would snag, causing you to use some force when shutting it. Another time I was watching TV, and my mom said it was time for bed. I shut my TV off, and at that exact moment of hitting the button on the set, my stereo turned on full blast, playing Free Bird. I screamed and ran to tell my parents, who laughed me off. Now my mom's brother, my Uncle Kenny, blew his brains out. I never met him, but my mom spoke of him fondly. Once, laying in bed alone, I thought of him out of the blue and started crying because I never got to meet him. My whole left leg began tingling and I froze up. For no reason, my 8-year-old self said, "Uncle Kenny, please get off my leg." The tingling stopped instantly. While that might not be crazy in itself, years later my mom mentioned to me that the song played at my uncle's funeral was Free Bird. These might just be weird occurrences, and while I've played with Ouija boards, spirit boxes, etc. over the years, nothing has quite had an effect on me like that duplex we lived in. When I was a child, I always believed in ghosts, but I gradually grew out of it until I had a genuine experience. For a short period of time, my ex and I started experiencing strange occurrences together. One night, we'd heard the front door open and shut, we even saw the light from outside, and I had just assumed my roommate came home. They were almost never home. We were surprised, so I got up to go say what's up, but nobody was home, and the front door was locked. We just chopped it up to maybe it being the door across from our apartment. As for the light, maybe we were seeing things. Later on a different night we had both woken up at the same time, and out of nowhere my bedroom doorknob twisted and the door opened. It made us both kind of scream because it was like 3 in the morning at that point, and I was fully expecting someone to come inside, but nobody was there. 2 more times the door would do the same thing throughout the week during different times of the day. It was freaky. Then one night it all came to a head. Once again, we woke up at the same time in the middle of the night. My ex's back was turned to me, and I saw these black bands of cloth hanging down from the ceiling, thinking, WTF? I had turned over to see what the hell was coming from the ceiling. That's when I saw the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. There was a hooded figure protruding out of the ceiling, its arms arched like it was pushing itself out. There was no face, just pitch black where a face should be, and everything about the entity was alive. It was like its robe was a living being that had a mind of its own that attached itself to this thing. Hard to explain, but the way the robe moved made it appear like its own conscious being. It was swirling around more like water than actual cloth. It was gray with patches of black, but the texture looked like skin or leather. It was fanned out around the ceiling with black strips hanging down off of it that were constantly moving around. I immediately shut down in fear. I froze and automatically started to scream at the top of my lungs. My ex, startled, looked up and saw exactly what I had seen and started screaming, "What the duck is that?" over and over again while pulling the blanket up over her head. I squeezed my eyes tight and begged this thing to go away. I begged for it to disappear. I couldn't describe the amount of fear I felt in that moment. It was unreal. Eventually I had opened my eyes, and it was gone. Apartment security had come and knocked on our door to ask us what the screaming was about because the neighbors had called. They showed probably 5 minutes later. My ex and I told them what we had seen and probably looked like meth addicts. I would have chopped it up to sleep paralysis, but I've never had sleep paralysis, and my ex was able to describe exactly what I had seen myself. Sends chills down my spine still. I'm 27, husband is 30, daughter is 1. This story happened last night. So to start, my husband, our 1-year-old, and myself live in a rental and have been here for 3 years now. When we first moved in, there was a random doorbell that would go off. There isn't a doorbell here that we can see. We thought that there was probably a battery-powered doorbell stored in the attic that was likely dying or malfunctioning. That eventually stopped, and we forgot about it for the most part. My husband also used to see what he called shadow people, hear footsteps, and have horrible sleep paralysis dreams. I always chalked it up to his mind playing trick on him or him trying to scare me. It's been a few years since any of that has happened, though, and for the year that our daughters lived with us, 0 spooky things happened until last night. My husband works the night shift, so it's just me and the baby most nights. Well, last night my daughter woke up around midnight, so I got her and brought her to my bed. She is back asleep, and I'm wide awake scrolling through Hulu. As I'm searching for a show to watch, I kid you, not the foot of my bed, frame, and all lifts like half a foot off the ground and slams back down. My daughter is still asleep, but I'm frozen in fear. My first thought is there is someone under my bed, but I quickly realized that I couldn't even fit under our bed, so that is far-fetched but not any better. I quickly scoop my daughter up football style, stand on my bed, jump off as far as possible, and run out of the room. I grab our gun, call my husband, shaking and sobbing, to please come home, then call my mom to come pick us up, one vehicle family. At that point, our kitchen lights start to dim until they are completely off, which was the last straw. I took my daughter and went to the front yard in only a t-shirt and pants until my husband got home, like 10 minutes. He did a sweep of the house, and nothing seemed out of place, which weirdly only made me more scared. I would rather a stranger be under my bed than some invisible force, but I still went to my mom's. I finally fell asleep around 3:30, and my husband picked us up at 5 a.m. when he got off work. I'm afraid to sleep here, so I've been awake ever since. I don't know how I'm going to be here alone at night anymore. I'm trying to debunk what happened and find an explanation, but I can't. It may not sound scary to you, but I never felt so scared in my life, and scary stuff is 10 times worse when you have a baby to protect. What do I do? How do I bless my house correctly without making this worse? Also, I don't drink or do any drugs, so it's not like I was just tripping. My mom is a paranormal buff, and my husband and I agreed after one too many crappy spouses in scary movies to always believe each other when we say something is up, so they both believe me, but I still feel crazy. Not sure it counts as paranormal, but I suppose they're a cryptid. I saw one of those big black cats that people deny the existence of. It was on a dirt road not far from Scole, Victoria, in 2014 to 2015. It was just lying on the road in the sun. I got up and casually walked off into the bush. The car was stopped only a few meters from it, and it stood taller than the bonnet. I own German Shepherds, and this thing dwarfed them. Everyone says they're just big ferals, but I don't think it's possible. Even with selective breeding, the biggest breed of cats doesn't get heavier than 12 kilograms. This thing looked to have weighted 30 kilograms at minimum. It would have been more than capable of taking out a cow. About 5 years ago, when I was 17, I visited some of my family who lived in SD and worked there for the summer. After about a month, my brother, sister, and her husband decided to do what Americans do best and go shoot guns in the woods. Since I was working an evening shift, we decided to leave around 10 p.m. Once my shift ended, we went to their house to pack up the truck with some snacks, guns, and ammo. The drive took around 45 minutes, and it took us up a dirt road surrounded by trees and tall grass. Eventually, it opened up into a clearing that was pretty open and flat. The nearest tree line was about 100 feet away. It was pretty dark, but the clearing was lit up by the truck's headlights. I kind of felt uneasy, but I chalked it up to just being in the woods at night. For the first 20 minutes nothing really happened. We were just setting up plastic bottles and those plastic gallon buckets you'd get water out of at an office. There was a feeling of being watched that we all felt. The area suddenly reeked of spoiled eggs. Those of you who have shotguns know they can smell, but even since going to the military, no amount of guns or explosions has smelt this bad. We looked around to see if we could see the source, and what I saw I can still vividly remember to this day. What I saw was a thin humanoid figure crouching down, looking at us. Even while crouching down, it was still about 6 feet in height. When I say this figure was thin, I mean skin and bones. Barely does it justice. The even weirder thing about this was we all saw the figure in different spots in the tree line, but we all described the same features. Tall, thin, and had long, dark hair. We quickly packed up what we could and left. The feeling of dread I felt that day will forever haunt me. Since then, my brother mentioned the area might have been in native territory, but I don't know if that's true. Every once in a while I think back on that day and look up different stories and encounters people have in woods, but nothing quite resembles what I saw that day. A few nights ago, I was getting ready to go to bed. I turned off my light and laid down. Sometimes I feel as though I'm being watched while I go to bed, so I will open my eyes occasionally to watch my surroundings. Normally nothing is ever there, but this time, however, there was. When I opened my eyes, I saw what appeared to be a ball of darkness. I wasn't sure at first if anything was there, but as my eyes adjusted, it became clear that there was something much darker than its surroundings in front of me. It seemed to be about 2 feet in diameter or so. I panicked and fumbled for my phone, not knowing what was in front of me. When I got a hold of my phone, I turned on my flashlight expecting to see something, but to my surprise, there was nothing there. The only evidence of anything being there was a cord that was hanging from my ceiling, swinging back and forth quite a lot. I would have simply brushed this off, however, there is not much air circulation in my room, and it was too far from my hand to have touched it when I went for my phone. I'm not sure what I saw, but this is my first major paranormal encounter. Not sure what I should do about it. Okay, so, to start out, I'm fairly skeptical of the paranormal, so I don't really know what to believe, but the only stories that are even a little similar to what I experienced all seem to be paranormal. So to give some backstory, my street and neighborhood are pretty quiet, especially at night due to the number of young families and elderly couples that live on my street, which makes staying up into the early hours of the morning more relaxing and also a bit cooler knowing I'm most likely the only person on my street that's awake. The only thing is that I've had some creepy experiences, like hearing noises or even seeing a few drug deals, but most of that can be chalked up to living next to a big forest with lots of wildlife or just some sketchy neighbors. But for the past week, I've been trying to find a logical explanation for the strange events that keep occurring. It began at 2 a.m. last Tuesday morning. I was just sitting in bed on my phone with earbuds in, something I do almost every night, when I began to hear whistling coming from outside my window. I took my earbuds out and began listening to the whistling, trying to come up with an explanation. Normally I'm not scared by anything in my neighborhood this late, and to be honest, I get more excited that something's happening and I'm there to witness it, but this time felt different. I wanted so badly to get up to look out my window, but I was almost paralyzed with fear. I don't know what came over me, but every minute that went by of this whistling, I felt the pit in my stomach growing larger. It went on for almost an hour, and for the entire hour I waited for the whistling to start a tune or a song I could look up, but it just kept whistling the same note in a strange pattern. It would whistle one note for a good minute, then take a break for about 30 seconds and then return its 1-minute whistle until about 20 minutes in when the whistles got shorter and closer together, only to return to the original pattern after about 10 minutes. What was even more strange was that whatever it was pacing in front of mine and my neighbor's house, up until it stopped when it retreated back down the other side of the street. As I heard it leave, I almost immediately felt the pit in my stomach subside, and while I was still confused, I decided I should just go to sleep before I scare myself even more. So the next day I asked my parents and even some of my friends that live close by if they had ever heard anything like that. Everyone assumed it was an animal, which made me feel a lot better, but I wanted a definite answer to what I heard. I stayed up for hours that night researching the types of animals that were local to my area and the noises they made. I didn't find anything that matched. This only left me more frustrated that I had no clue what it was, so I continued staying up in hopes I would hear it again and that this time I would look out my window to see it. But with my luck, I never heard the whistling again, except lots of other weird things have been happening. After the whistle, I began hearing someone or something walking around in mine and my neighbor's driveways and sometimes even yards very late at night, but whenever I go to check, I can't see anything. Then about 2 nights ago when I swore I saw a figure of a person lurking behind my neighbor's car, then the night after that I saw what looked like a flashlight in the woods near my house, and whatever it was that was holding the flashlight was running out of the woods, and then again last night I swore I saw a person crouching near my neighbor's car just looking around. I thought I was done researching because I couldn't find anything about any animals, but now I've begun researching any stories even similar to mine, hoping that I'm either not alone or even better someone has the answer to the strange occurrences, because I would like to start sleeping at a more normal time again and not be worried about either a stalker or a poltergeist coming to get me in my sleep. I've never talked about this outside of 2 other people, and they've had experience with this entity too, though not in the same way. Since I was a very young child, I've had this sort of entity, for lack of a better term, around me. I can sense when he's there and sort of tell what he's feeling. Like if someone was really mad in the room, you could sense it. But he's comforting. There's times when I'm in this half-awake/half asleep state where he can talk better. I would just chalk it up to my mind, but he has affected physical things. Like the feeling of someone sitting on the bed, things moving, etc. And then the point I started realizing it wasn't just in my head was when I was laying in bed having a disagreement with my late husband, and all of a sudden he just gets pushed off the bed. And not like if I had done it where the first thing starting to move would be his chest, but his whole body in one straight line was pushed off. He actually jumped up and said that was the entity, wasn't it? Like he could tell. And that's happened with my current husband, too. I'll be on the other side of the room, and something will push him hard. That's enough to knock him over. And I'm just 5 feet 3 inches compared to his almost 5 feet 11 inches. My current husband has said it has to be the entity, like he can sense this different energy when it reacts to him. But I don't know what it is. I know this sounds strange. I was just hoping I could get some ideas or leads on where to look for some answers. Thank you. When I was 14 years old, I went to a church gathering on Halloween night that was called Hallelujah Night, a Christian alternative to Halloween. My family and I would get there in the afternoon since we'd volunteer to help set up the booths, cake walk, candy barrels, etc., but I was mostly there to get first dibs on all of the candy. After I finished helping with the usual booth I helped set up, I took a seat on a bench near the main sanctuary. It was my favorite place to sit since I could see the entire lot and, most of all, the beautiful sunset. I pulled out my PSP and was scrolling through some music I had on it when some guy approached me and started a conversation. I've never been a people person, so usually when things like this happen, I keep the conversation short. However, this guy had this weird type of warmth about him, as if he were a friend of mine. As the conversation carried on, I started to ask him if he was new because I hadn't seen him before. He told me that he had been going to this church for years but left after an incident happened. When I asked him about the incident, he paused, looked at me, and said that there's some things people pick up on that they know aren't normal. Also, you should never get curious about things that you know you should leave alone. I had a sort of confused look on my face since I didn't know what he meant at the time. The guy noticed it and said that I would understand once I got older. I looked down at my PSP that I had in my hand still and looked back up, and the guy was gone. I looked around and couldn't find him anywhere in the lot except for a few people still preparing for Hallelujah night. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward to a few months later, and I was sitting in the main sanctuary before leaving to do my usual volunteer work on the upper floor of the main sanctuary. The upper floor was a daycare area for kids. So at the end of service, volunteers would escort the children downstairs, and I would go into each room, shutting off the lights and making sure no children were still up there. I'll never forget getting up to leave to do my usual duties when the pastor started talking about an upcoming funeral. I looked at the big screens on each side of the main sanctuary, and the face of the man I was talking to during Hallelujah night was there. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. To this day, it still seems unreal. I was beyond shook as I made my way out of the main sanctuary and to the flights of big stairs as I went to the upper floor. Once I made it up to the upper floor, another volunteer confirmed that all the children were escorted downstairs. She noticed that I had looked sort of pale from seeing what I saw in the main sanctuary and asked me if I was okay. I told her it was nothing and proceeded to cut off all of the lights on the upper floor as she left downstairs. The upper floor was like a giant hallway with doors on each side and a door at the end of the hallway with a giant window in it. When I came to the last room at the end of the hall, I would always leave the blinds on that big window open since the light always illuminated the dark hallway and made me feel less scared. But as I left the room, I remember feeling panicked. It started freezing, and I felt like if I left that room, something was waiting for me in the darkened rooms that was going to jump out and attack me. As I'm trying to muster up the courage to just run for it, I see a small head of a child peeking out a couple of doors down. It stayed there for a few seconds, then put its head back in the room. I immediately called out to the child but got no answer. The fear I had a minute ago was gone as I left the last room to go through the illuminated hallway. I made it to the other room in a matter of seconds, cutting on the lights and searching the entire room for the child I saw. But no one was there. I started getting spooked again as I cut off the lights in that room. Then one of the most terrifying things I have ever seen and experienced happened. As I was leaving the room, I looked back at the last room's window, which illuminated the hallway, and out of nowhere, a massive black mass moved in front of the window, almost covering the light completely. It was darker than black, and its outline as it covered the light seemed to be moving. It was enough to scare me to run for my life. I ran through the hallway and down the stairs. I was stopped by one of the ushers who told me not to run, but when I told him what I saw, he looked at me as if I were crazy. Once church was over, I told my parents about what happened on the ride home and they ended up not believing me since they're skeptics. But I know what I saw that day, and it's something that still scares me to this very day. Since I was a child, I've always had very peculiar, not necessarily unexplainable, experiences. Coming from a Christian home, my family has more or less come to believe and accept that strange things happen around me, and for better or worse they deal with it. And in their case, they pray. This is but a side note, however, a small little relic of background information to hopefully allow the full impact of what follows to sink in. So, the relation to my family. My brother's room is rather large compared to the other rooms in the house. He has a bed, but he also has room for small chairs and a futon couch that he sometimes uses when his friends come over. And, from time to time, when he's up late playing video games or watching movies, he ends up falling asleep on that futon couch instead of his bed. My brother and I are not particularly close, at least not emotionally, but he's confident enough in me that when strange things happen, he can speak with me about them. So he approached me one night, telling me he was frightened to go back to sleep. Since he woke me up, I didn't really understand what was happening. He waited until I gained more control of my mental faculties and explained that something had come into his room. During this time period, It was very typical for my mother to enter our rooms before she left for work so that she could let our dogs go outside. So we were very used to the minor disturbance she'd cause by opening our doors and calling the animals. This particular night, he had fallen asleep on his futon couch, and he told me that she opened the door and entered the room, which was rare. She usually just called the dogs from the doorway, shut the door behind her, and then stood over his proper bed for quite some time, just staring down at where he normally slept, but without moving, speaking, or sounding at all. Initially, he brushed it off as a waking remnant of a dream. However, as he came to himself, he said that she remained standing over his bed. As he fully awoke, he felt a deep and incredible fear, and something in him told him to keep silent and not try to get her attention. Something was wrong. After what he claimed to be a substantial period of time, the figure that appeared to be our mother began to seem less and less like her and more like a living apparition from a nightmare, and it began muttering incomprehensibly, looking up and down the length of his bed, and eventually turning to look towards the futon couch for some time before dissipating into the shadows. How does this relate to my night terrors? Around this same period, I had begun experiencing a recurring nightmare, where a humanoid figure hunched upon all fours, lacking any eyes and only possessing nostril slits and a predatory mouth, would torment me in my sleep. I was not in the habit of sharing my nightmares with anyone, but I kept a private journal where I would sketch the figures I'd see or words I would hear during my states of sleep paralysis, which inevitably followed my waking. When my brother explained to me the feeling of complete and abject fear that set in as this figure who feigned to be our mother slowly transformed into whatever it was that it is, my hair began to stand on end. I asked him if he could recall what it looked like, and he responded with a yes, saying that he could not ever forget it because of the horror it instilled within him. I asked him to describe it and, if possible, draw a picture. As he scrawled the figure, the fear solidified, a hunched, humanoid creature walking on all fours and lacking any eyes. I said nothing to him and have kept my silence to this day. I've never shared this story with anyone besides my immediate family, but this was by far the weirdest/strangest thing that has happened in my life and the reason I believe in the supernatural now, when previously I'd always been somewhat of a skeptic. The story sounds so unreal to the point of being BS. But it did happen. I won't blame you though if you don't believe it. It took place about 2 years ago, on a summer night. I was home alone, my entire family was on vacation. The time was exactly 3:33 a.m. I remember vividly looking at my alarm clock. I'm about to head to bed when suddenly my friend Eric, who lives in a city about 20 miles away, calls me in the middle of the night somewhat frantically in a cold sweat. This is extremely abrupt and unlike him. He starts off immediately with, "Dude, I'm sorry if this sounds ducking off the rocker, but I need to let you know I had a terrible dream and just woke up to find that something broke into your house." I didn't think much of it and was about to call him batshit crazy and hang up the phone and go to bed. Then it happened. I heard some slight creaking of floorboards in my kitchen. At the exact time this happens, my friend on the line is like, "Yeah, I'm not kidding, it scared me legit. If I'm not on drugs, whatever it is was in your kitchen." I immediately got the chills because of the timing. But I'm no superhero and had no weapon, so I was scared shitless hiding in my room. I almost felt its presence. You know how if someone's super angry near you or something, you can kind of feel the vibe of rage? Yeah. Hard to explain, but I intuitively felt the energy, the vibe of something in my house. Drawing closer, pacing towards the hallway. Coming towards my room. It was a strong energy. I froze. Was at a loss for words and shitting bricks at this point. Because despite any of this not making any sense, I knew my friend was right. At this point, whatever it was basically right behind my closed door. It felt like I could feel it through the door, having a piercing gaze on me. But I knew it wasn't a person. A person would make noise, I'd be able to see a shadow or shoes at the bottom of the door. It was some non-material, some being without a physical body of sort. I've never encountered this shit in my life. It was waiting to see if I'd open the door. I touched the door handle, and for whatever reason it was freezing cold. At this point, I'm doubling down to face my fears and opening the door in one swift motion with a war cry, and then, as I did, all went black. Don't remember a single thing. I passed out. I woke up in a tiny puddle of diarrhea. I looked up. It was 4:13 a.m. I had been unconscious for 40 minutes. To this day, my friend Eric and I now believe there's more to this world we simply won't understand. Okay, so my friend had a house, and I became convinced that it was haunted. I had a few weird incidents there, and I became thoroughly convinced there were multiple presences at that location. I was about 16 or 17 years old, and there was a bungalow or granny flat in the backyard. We were all out there talking and having a good time, It was a scorching day, with temperatures reaching over 38 degrees Celsius. I had really long hair, and I was trying to cool down. I had put my hair up on the back of this big armchair, trying to get a bit of breeze on the back of my neck. I felt something stroking my hair, then something running fingers through my hair. I am surprised by this. The chair basically backs onto a wall. There is no room for anyone to be standing behind me doing this. I jump up suddenly and look behind the chair. Nothing. A few minutes go by, and it happens again. I get up once more and check. There is nothing behind the chair, and no one is near me that could be doing this. I can feel the pull when the hair snags. It is not the wind. This happens several times. Other people start to notice that I am getting up repeatedly and looking behind this chair. They ask what I am doing, and I explain that something is touching and pulling my hair, but I can't find what is doing it. They tell me, that's the rat. I freak out. A rat, you say? OMG, there has been a rodent trying to eat my hair or something. They explain no, it's not an actual rat, that's just what they call it. They then tell me that other people won't go out there, one especially, because they are convinced something is touching them. They have been laughing at them, calling them crazy, and telling them it must be the rat. Okay then, I am not sitting in this chair anymore. Another time I went there, it was late at night and I was walking through a little alleyway at the side of their house that connected the bungalow to the house. It is very narrow, and you kind of had to squeeze past a row of bushes to get to the back door. I am about 2 to 3 meters in, and I look up, and there is what I can only describe as a dense mist moving rapidly towards me. I freeze. WTF is that? I stand there like an idiot. This mist moves towards and through me, and I just feel put in terror. Every hair is standing up, and I wanted to get the heck out of there. My brain scrambled to identify what it was. I ran through thousands of possibilities in milliseconds, and as soon as my brain identified ghost, there was no other option for me. To say I was scared is an understatement. I couldn't get in that house fast enough. The third thing that happened there was at night. I went to sleep in the living room. I woke up at about 3 a.m. with something sitting on my chest. It felt like it was choking and trying to squeeze the life out of me. I was suddenly wide awake and freaking out. There was no one there, but I could feel malevolence. I know this sounds corny, but at that moment I became a true believer at that point. I had a thought about Jesus and pictured a white light, and I swear to God I have never prayed that hard in my life. The weight lifted and disappeared, and I could breathe normally again. I went and got their cat and hugged it like a life preserver for the rest of the night. The next morning my friend's sister asked how I slept, and I told her what had happened. She then made a comment I will always remember: there's a reason I don't sleep out there. After that, I didn't go back there again. I am not an atheist, but I do consider myself skeptical. I don't believe in most paranormal things anymore, although as a child I did. To this day, I do enjoy reading the reports of paranormal activity because I still love a good scary story. In this realm, my favorite subject is UFOs. Once again, I consider myself skeptical here. I don't believe that the Roswell case was really a crashed alien spacecraft. I don't buy into the etc. I think alien abductions are really a psychological phenomenon rather than an actual event. But even I have seen some stuff, and I have one really good sighting. When I was about 12 years old, I was at a Boy Scout campout with a couple hundred other boys sitting around a big campfire at night while people were doing comedy skits. Next thing I know, I see everyone pointing up and gasping. I couldn't figure out what they were looking at until I looked straight up. Hovering about 200 feet directly overhead of our bonfire was an enormous black object. It was completely silent, and we wouldn't have even known it was there except for the different lights all over the bottom of the thing. The lights were in a diamond or square shape. I think there were white lights at each corner, and in the center was a blinking red light. It hung overhead of us for a few moments, then rotated a bit and headed off out of sight over the trees. I would say it was house-sized, if not larger. It never made a sound. After it left, we just went on with the comedy skits like nothing even happened. In fact, nobody really even talked about it. Since then I went on to learn to fly airplanes and get into amateur astronomy. I have seen many kinds of unusual natural phenomena over the years, and being a pilot myself, I'm very familiar with seeing all types of different aircraft at night. 34 years on, I still have no idea what that thing was. I could hazard a few guesses but have no way of proving any of them. A few weeks ago I was listening to a podcast where a UFO sighting was reported of a very similar silent black object hovering over a drive-in theater full of people. After it flew away, everyone just went on with what they were doing before it appeared, as if it was so strange that nobody could even process it, so they just ignored it. I found myself shouting, "Yes! Yes! That's exactly what happened to us." When I was 6 years old, my mom got a new boyfriend, and after a few months, he came to live with us. and she got pregnant. I was 7 when my first brother was born, and not long after his birth, we were forced to move to a different city after complications involving my biological father. I was obviously not told about the adult reasons behind our move, but still felt upheaved and anxious about moving to a different city a good 2 to 3 hours away from my hometown, where family I was close with lived. It was summer before I started my new school. My relationship with my new father figure had gone from bad to worse. He was physically abusive and always made me feel inferior to my baby brother, only mentioning this in case it holds any relevance to what I saw, since I don't really understand why. One scorching summer night, I was laying awake in bed, unable to sleep due to the stifling heat. I only had a thin, see-through sheet on my bed. My room was pitch black, and my bedside digital clock read 3:12. I began feeling uneasy once I realized my parents were definitely asleep by now and I was unprotected. As if on cue, I remember seeing my door that was always closed on the hinge slowly opening. I immediately felt my heart drop to my stomach, but hoped that perhaps my mom had felt my anxiety and was coming to check on me. Instead, the door widened more and more until it was nearly fully open. The light from the end of the hallway managed to illuminate my room a bit, just enough for me to be able to see a figure forming at the edge of my door. I remember being frozen with fear and tension and wishing that the light in the hallway wasn't on so I didn't have to see whatever the figure was. Finally, I could make out the stranger. It was an elderly lady in a wheelchair that no one was pushing. I couldn't see her face, her head was hung, and her limbs were limp. She was a plump woman in a long dress/skirt and woolen shawl, but her clothes looked worn and colorless. She looked like she was dead. I was freaking out, but I was too scared to scream in case she moved towards me or I got in trouble with my stepfather. She sat there, motionless for what felt like forever, and I was unable to take my eyes off her. Then, as if something clicked in her, her head snapped up, making me flinch. I could feel my heart pounding in my head, adding to the panic rising in my throat. I was staring right at her when the skin on her face started changing color, turning into a light gray. Her eyes sunk deeper and deeper into her skull, and her jaw dropped, and the shawl that once hugged her close was now clinging to her loosely. She was disintegrating, decomposing. At this point, I tore my eyes from the sight and quickly hid under the thin sheet that was my bedding. It didn't do much as I watched her turn into a corpse. I felt fat tears running down my face and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep like a mantra in my head. After a while of keeping my eyes tightly shut in hopes of calming down enough to sleep, I took a deep breath and braced myself to open my eyes. What I saw has seared itself into my memory, and I've been unable to forget it ever since. Her disembodied head was right in front of my face, eyes no longer there, and with her mouth wide opened in a silent scream. She was an inch away from my face, with only the thin bedsheet separating us. I had definitely seen enough for one night. I screwed my eyes shut once again, quietly counting sheep under my breath in between sobs. I don't know how long I lay there, totally still, before sleep eventually came to me. Of course, when the sun came up and I woke up, she was gone and my door was closed. But not fully closed. Not on the hinge. The detail unsettled me enough to not even bring it up to my parents until bedtime came again, and I was forced to give an explanation as to why I needed my mom to lay with me until I fell asleep. She brushed it off as a dream but consoled me nonetheless. A year passed, and we moved to the UK. I refused to ever stay up past 2 a.m. and always kept the cover over my head and my eyes shut on nights I couldn't fall asleep until I was well into my teenage years. By and by, I was able to pass it off as a figment of my imagination and would talk about it with my friends when the topic of ghosts came up without worrying that if I mentioned the woman, she would come back. One night, I was home alone with my mom after watching a horror movie, and I remembered the experience. I brought it up with her and laughed it off, but her face darkened. She hesitated when I questioned her look, and after a fair bit of grilling, she sighed at me, saying that I was older now and that deemed it safe to fill me in. She explained to me that one of her close friends at the time was sensitive to energies, whether that be people's energies or an object. My mom had invited this friend over for coffee once I had started school. Naturally, she showed her friend around the house, and when she got to my room, she stopped in her tracks. Apparently, she told my mom she could sense a negative feminine energy in my room. My mom said her blood ran cold as she realized that what I had told her was not just some scary nightmare but actually true. Of course, she didn't tell me at the time because I would have been insufferable, but she said she had her friend burn some sage. It must have worked, because I never saw the woman again. My Ouija board experience almost ruined a party. I'll set the scene: house party, drunk kids all in the middle of nowhere, cornered in the deep woods, at the dead of night. As the nights winded down, the spiritual and or ghoulish folks thought it'd be a good idea to crack into the Ouija board. Myself, having the liquid courage and interest in the occult, decided this would be a good time to use an Ouija board. For the first time. Only one other girl and I were brave enough to try. We all drunkenly shuffled to the basement to retrieve the board, set up a circle, and dimmed the lights. When not getting a response the first time, we politely closed it out and tried again. The spirit we started communicating with the second time felt upset, almost violent, and disturbed. The answers and responses started getting weirder and weirder. It all came to a head when a shuffling followed by a crash in the back corner of the room echoed. An area in which no one was in. Every individual in that house was accounted for. Everyone in the room slowly locked eyes and almost simultaneously started running for the stairs. The girl on the other side of the planchette started to look beyond and above my shoulder with wide eyes. I felt angry, with white-hot daggers on my back. I didn't want to know what she saw until we successfully closed the session. The board had resistance when we were trying to close it, which left me unsettled. Still feeling these daggers piercing my back. Finally closing the board, we just sat with ourselves for a moment. With just her and me left in this big, empty, dark basement, we tried to bring in light energy and a sense of levity. My friend started talking about her past grandmother on her maternal side, whom she had a beautiful relationship with. I surprised myself and her by describing her late grandmother. Never have I met or seen this woman, living or dead. Not even seen a singular picture. But somehow I knew exactly what she looked like, down to her favorite hairstyle and iconic patterned slippers. I have not had many, if any, experiences regarding mediumships or communication with the dead. I truly felt like her grandmother had come to help us close this board. Without her, I'm not sure what would have happened. Safe to say, I learned my lesson and have never touched a board since. I want to start by saying that I really want to believe the things I've seen or experienced were just my mind playing tricks on me, but it's happened too often for me to dismiss it entirely. I was raised to believe that ghosts don't exist, but I also grew up hearing ghostly experiences from the same people who told me that. So, I never truly dismissed the idea of ghosts. I just feel like we all share a space, and as long as we don't bother each other, it's fine. That said, I want to share the first, very visible, paranormal encounter I had. It was March 2015, and I had just finished my finals that day. After returning from school, I took a nap, felt refreshed, and around 7 p.m., there was a power cut. Power cuts are fairly common where I live, so I decided to pass the time by walking along the pathway leading to our garage, which was between our house and our garden. It was dark, but the moonlight provided enough visibility. I could see the road outside our property clearly, but where I was standing wasn't visible to anyone passing by. Like a typical teenager, I stood there listening to music, just doing random things. After a while, I was standing in front of the garage, facing the road, when I suddenly felt someone behind me. Before I could turn around, I sensed that this person was bending down towards my right side, and I could see a face behind my right elbow. I turned my head to look, and it was me. I was staring at myself, but the other me had this huge grin that I'll never forget. Honestly, I've tried to mimic it in front of mirrors, but I physically can't do it. I ran, or more like speed walked, back into the house, unable to explain what I'd just seen. It was just me and my mother at home at the time, and it wasn't even past 8 p.m. When I told her what happened, she joked that it might be one of the guys who got murdered on our property in the 1940s. Apparently, our property used to be a well-known garden open to the public, and according to one of my grandfather's friends, 3 murders had taken place in one day there, after which people stopped visiting the garden as much. After this incident, there were other small occurrences that I ignored. At one point, I stayed in the house alone for as long as 5 months. Even during those months, I would experience things randomly. I felt taps on my shoulder, heard clapping, and once I heard what sounded like whispers outside our living room window. That particular incident made me stay awake in the living room until dawn, fearing we were about to be robbed. I'm more scared of humans than ghostly beings. These tiny occurrences didn't really bother any of my family members, but then something happened in early 2023. My grandmother, who has dementia, had moved in with us. We always had someone attending to her so she wouldn't wander off, which she had tried to do multiple times. Grandma had her own sofa in the living room, and she would only sit there. This sofa was visible from the dining room, which was connected to my room, so whenever I left my room, I would see her sitting on her sofa. One evening, I decided to take a nap in my room while my mom sat with my grandma. It was just the 3 of us at home. It was around 4 p.m., everything was fairly bright, but we still had our living room lights on. Instead of taking a nap, I was scrolling through my phone with my headphones on when my mom suddenly came running into my room. She frantically said something that I couldn't hear over my loud headphones. By the time I took them off, all I could hear was "Help Grandma," and she ran out of my room toward the kitchen, trying to get to our backyard, where my grandma was sitting on the floor. For some reason she would always sit on the floor, and she was heavy enough that only my dad or I could lift her up. So, I jumped out of bed and ran after my mom. But as I passed the living room, I saw my grandma sitting on the sofa. While running, I tried to ask my mom why she was heading to the backyard when grandma was in the living room. But before I could finish my sentence, I stepped outside into the backyard and saw my grandma sitting on the floor. I stood still for a few seconds, confused as my mom struggled to lift her up. I eventually composed myself and helped her. That's when I realized that the grandma who was sitting on the sofa was wearing a different dress. I told my parents about this that very evening and also brought up what I had experienced back in 2015. That's when my mom mentioned that she, too, had experienced some unexplainable things, nothing as visible as what I had seen, but she had felt things. Since then, activities have become more common occurrences. The creepiest one for me was when I felt as if someone was climbing onto my bed while I was on it. My bed creaked the same way it does when someone climbs onto it. I thought it could be my breathing, so I held my breath for a good 20 seconds and stayed still. The bed was still creaking. I freaked out, jumped out of bed, and turned on the lights. But, as usual, there was nothing. When I got back into bed, the creaking stopped. My parents are usually very dismissive of the idea of ghosts, but even they have sensed things they can't explain. All we know is that whatever or whoever this might be isn't harmful. Still, I would like to believe that my mind is just making things up. It was late at night. I was using my phone in the living room when my mom appeared from behind me. I was on the sofa, and she stood behind it on my right side so I could see her with my peripheral vision. She said something pretty simple. "Go to bed," I said. "I'll go later." She responds, "No, you must go now." I respond, "Fine, just a minute." The second whatever that thing was turned around to leave, I felt my blood go cold in my veins, chills down my spine, and a horrible feeling of dread. My thoughts kept going, "That's not Mom, that's not Mom, that's not Mom." So I immediately got up to catch it. It ran away, so I chased it down the corridor. It ran to my mother's room. I was right behind it, so I turned the lights on. My mom was asleep in her bed. The thing is, when she walks, she makes a lot of sound. That thing made none. And her bed at that time was super creaky. There is no way she got in it without making any sounds. Anyway, when I turned the lights on, I saw my brother in the room. I asked him if he came to the living room, and he said no. I asked him if Mom got up and left the room, and he said, "I've been watching her the whole time because I'm using her phone and don't want to cough. She didn't even get up." So I was mortified, but that thing that took my mom's shape and voice was insisting I go to the bedroom, so I did. When I entered, I saw my sister on her bed. She was sitting up with her blanket around her. The first thing she told me was, "Thank God you came in here. This whole time I kept hearing knocking under both our beds, and it stopped the second you came into the room." I still can't tell what the hell that was. There were no gas leaks, and I wasn't sleepy because I had slept the whole day and woke up for the night. My true paranormal experience. This account is completely true, but you can believe what you want. I wouldn't believe it had not happened to me. I was 8 years old at the time, and I had very vivid dreams and nightmares. I later found out that the dreams and nightmares I had weren't just dreams. To this day, I still don't understand why this happened, or how. I've heard it called a few different names: astral projection, out-of-body experience, etc. The night in question led me to realize what had been happening years down the road. Keep in mind, this happened 5 years before Insidious came out. And I kind of repressed it up until seeing that movie. It wasn't the same as my encounter, but it was equally terrifying. We were a poor family, just my mother and her 3 children in a 1-bedroom apartment. Her boyfriend was there occasionally too, and I'm really glad he was there that night. My brother, who was 2 to 2.5 at the time, and I shared a bed that was in our dining room. My mom had her bed in her room, and my baby sister had a crib and a walk-in closet. At this point, she would have been approximately 6 months old. There was this stain on the wall that was reminiscent of those paintings that follow your movement with their creepy eyes. I stared at this thing on multiple occasions, wondering what in the heck could have created such a weird stain. I had this creepy feeling when I looked at it. It seemed so familiar to me. I can only describe its appearance as some sort of demonic dragon-man hybrid. The creepy red guy in Insidious had nothing on this thing except it shared a similarity. Those yellow eyes. The stain had been there a few months, and I woke up sweating and crying more and more. The night everything happened, however, I was stuck in the corner of the bedroom, very near the ceiling. I remember looking down at my body beside my screaming brother, who was pointing to the other side of the room. The stain was on the exact other side of the wall from where this thing was. I could see my brother screaming at it and trying to wake me up. Every fiber of my being was trying to wake up, but some force was holding me back. I had this goosebump sensation run up my spine, and I looked over to the other side of the room as my mom and her boyfriend half ran into the room to see what was wrong. My mom's boyfriend was a big dude, and he was prepared to whoop ass if it was an intruder. I saw the creature right as they entered. To this day, I believe it's a demon, and I don't believe it's gone for good. My brother was screaming, "There's a man. He's a snake, he's here to take me and Johnny." Not my real name, but I'd prefer not to disclose that. My mom's boyfriend, we'll call him Jack, was a pretty ballsy dude and often bragged about the time he came back to life after 30-some minutes when his truck was hit by a semi. His being on the other side for those 30 minutes did something to him, though. Behind that tough guy shell, he was actually more afraid of what was out there in the world than you could imagine. Jack saw whatever the duck you can even call it in the corner after hearing my brother screaming, and I mean, he actually saw it. And what's more, he turned his head my way and saw me. Not the body in the bed snoring as all hell is going on in the same room. The me in the corner opposite the monster. He hesitated for a minute and then left for the other room. He came back with what appeared to be a really old book. It wasn't an old Bible, though. It was something different. He started reading words from it aloud and inching towards the demon. The demon seemed annoyed by this. At this point I felt like my life force was somehow being drained and felt even more restricted by whatever force was holding me in place. Jack turned in my general direction, almost seeming to look through me at this point, like he couldn't see me anymore, and said in a reassuring tone, "God is sending us an extra pair of wings." He then slammed the book closed, and from it emitted this bright light. It engulfed the whole room, and I felt like chains were being ripped away from my astral body. I could see the bright light pushing the monster into the wall, and just like that, it was out of the room. The light continued to grow, and I felt like I was forced back into my body. Hours later, I woke up. I thought I had just had the craziest dream ever, but upon waking up, I saw my mom pacing in the living room, and Jack was cleaning away the stain on the wall. I felt that privilege leave at the point and didn't have another dream for the next 6 or so years. Not even regular ones. But that was completely fine with me. I verified this story with both my mom and her boyfriend a couple years later, and my mom freaked out that I knew as much as I did. She saw me sitting there sleeping the whole time. After all, she didn't see what was in that other plane with me, but she knew it was there nonetheless. I still have questions, and over the years I have gotten some answers. I learned his name later on as well, from my brother. He was called Scole. I haven't been able to dig up any information on that name, but I can feel that fear once every time I think or say that word, so I know that somehow my little brother was right. If you have any information that could help me solve this and get some closure, don't hesitate to comment. And if you ever have a run-in with Scole, call a priest. I'm skeptic, but I now genuinely believe my house is haunted by spirits. I live with my family in a late 17th or early 18th century farmhouse. My grandmother has lived on one side for many years and had an incident where children were playing in the hallway one day when she was the only person home. The house hadn't been renovated for 100 years or so we had to do it and had a roofer in to redo the roof. One day, he said to my dad that he had met our spirits, a little girl who had apparently lost her shoe, and that they were very pleasant. Apparently he didn't know whether or not to say anything to my dad for fear of putting him off. Before moving in, I had an experience where I was outside with my mom and sister, and we heard a rapping at the window, 3 knocks, loudly. There was nobody inside, and nothing could have caused 3 distinct knocks. My dad had exactly the same experience a few months ago. My dad has heard footsteps coming from upstairs when there was nobody home. Doors have opened and closed on their own. My mom once saw who she thought was me in the house, distinctly a person similar to me. There was nobody home. I have a question. I've actually sat down and tried to speak to this spirit. I've asked questions and asked for a sign that I'm heard. Is there any way to get the spirit's attention or response without a seance or Ouija board? Is it possible? As I said, I am a skeptic, but after reading all 3 volumes of the 40 times it happened to me and researching astral projection, I'm no longer so sure that spirits don't exist. A further question is, why doesn't everyone leave a spirit behind when they die? Interested in hearing your responses and suggestions. So this was around 7 or 8 years ago. We were installing insulation in our minuscule attic space, which connected directly to my room through a door in our compact home. We had never opened this area since we moved in. I was sitting down on my bed when my parents opened the door, and immediately everything went wrong. My lights blew, 3 of them in one lamp and one in a separate lamp plugged into a different surge protector than the first, so I'm pretty sure it wasn't a freak electrical coincidence. My parents stopped what they were doing and went downstairs to check the breakers. I was still sitting on my bed, and the only light coming in was from the hallway. My door was open a little bit, so I could see maybe 1/4 of the room. I heard a more or less growling sound from the attic, and it scared the shit out of me because I thought there could be a raccoon or something in there. I didn't move because I didn't want to spook it or anything else. It kept going for a few minutes. Then I heard ridiculously loud footsteps, like someone stomping with all their might on the ground. Then I saw what was making the sounds, a maybe 7 or 8 foot tall shadow that was mostly defined but not detailed, walked out of the doorway, still making the massive footstep sounds, made a gesture that I can only assume was a come with me wave toward itself, and walked back through the doorway. I waited a few seconds after it was gone, shut the door immediately, and then my lights came back on. This all happened in the span of maybe 10 or so minutes, so when my parents came back up, I told them about what happened, and they said they didn't hear anything. I have no idea what happened today. I don't think I'm schizophrenic or anything, and I wasn't asleep, so it's not like this was sleep paralysis. I'm still skeptical of everything paranormal even after this because the whole event just seems so horror movie-ish to be real. I am a nurse, and in my 30 years of existence, I have not experienced something paranormal until last night. I'm on my second night's shift. I was sitting at our station, with the window behind my back. In front of me was my fellow nurse and a nursing assistant. I was busy charting when suddenly I heard someone whisper PSSSSD behind me. I immediately looked to the window behind me where I thought the sound was coming from and wondered who would dare to do that because we were on the second floor and it is 1:30 a.m. My colleagues were confused as they looked at me. I asked them if they heard someone whisper, but they said they didn't. I heard it clear as day, like there was a person behind me. So I got up and went to the window to look. There was nobody down there. It is already the back of the hospital where the electrical room and morgue are. I am a person who wants to see ghosts, although my friends and family say it is dangerous. I am hoping for it. I am a skeptical person. I love horror movies, and I always watch them alone in cinemas. I love the thrill it gives me. Anyway, after what happened last night, I realized that I've been seeing shadows lately on my peripheral vision during my shifts in the hospital, but I have never given much attention to it. However, the events of last night remain a mystery to me. I am still a skeptic though. I still think that there was a person below the window who did that. Any thoughts? After getting home from a long ride, motorcycles, my now ex-husband came in and stripped down to go get a shower. I went into the kitchen and did some of the dishes we had left before we went on our ride. As I was standing there looking out the window, I felt my husband walk up behind me and miss my neck and felt his breath on my ear. I stood there thinking he was getting frisky, so after a few seconds with my eyes closed, enjoying the moment, I turned around. There was no one there. I took off looking for him. He was in the shower. I asked him how long he had been there. He told me at least 10 minutes. I told him what happened. That was the first time a spirit got up close and personal with me, but not the last. I did tell them they could not touch me like that anymore. I woke up to see a solid black mass at least 6 feet tall standing beside my bed. I literally almost shot it. It was after my divorce, and I thought my ex had snuck back into my house. That would have been an embarrassing call to my insurance company. I have also seen light mists floating over me when I wake up in the middle of the night. I have seen orbs fly through my house, down the hall, and out my living room picture window. I have been locked out of my house, not the door handle lock but the deadbolt, and no one is in the house. I have had the spirits of my dogs come back to visit me, walking across me in the bed and lying down beside me. I have had the spirit of my grandmother and my mom both visit me on several occasions. My grandmother always comes when I have been either sick or very sad. My mom comes when I need reassurance of big decisions I am pondering. I have one thing that really freaks me out, and it isn't any of the above. On several occasions I have seen what looks like huge black spiders, but they are not anything that is alive. They come from the corner, where the wall meets the ceiling, and they roll, not crawl, across the ceiling, and as soon as they know that I am aware of their presence, they disappear into either the area of the ceiling fan or the smoke detector. Until about a week ago, that was as fast as I had ever seen them go too. A week ago, I woke and saw one suspended from a single thread over my bed. I freaked out, waking my dog, who then saw it and began barking and attacking it. It went in one quick motion up and rolled across the ceiling to the smoke detector and disappeared. I bought a UFI camera that is motion activated with all the bells and whistles. So far I haven't captured anything, but I am hopeful. Has anyone witnessed anything similar? I told my son, who suggested this brand of camera, He has them all over our properties, both homes, because of paranormal things that he and his wife have not witnessed. We live in a forest preserve in Northern Virginia. My son has been able to see and communicate with spirits since he was a young boy. I have always believed in him and have had mediums come to communicate with spirits. I have sage, tar water, salt, and crystals. This happened some time ago. On the first night sleeping in the house we had just moved into, as I was in bed about to fall asleep, I distinctly felt something press down on my feet as if a cat had curled up on the feet to sleep. Except my cat was not in my room. I looked at my feet and saw nothing but air, but still felt something pressing down on me. I thought nothing of it. It's hard to explain, but it always felt like I was being intently watched when I was in the large shower/bathroom, and again, I thought not much of it, but slowly over the next 2 months, odd happenings started piling up. I was chilling with my friends in my room one day, and I got up to get a drink from the kitchen. I closed the door to my room, we were smoking inside, and went to the kitchen and came back, but in that time they heard a knocking on the door, and they thought it was me, but there was no one there upon opening it. Then I got back, and they asked if I had knocked on the door. My cat was getting into a fight with the open air, like serious fight screaming, but it was just me and the cat in the house. At some point there was something that, like clockwork, every night would march up and down the one long hallway everyone's rooms were attached to, or you would clearly hear something heavy be knocked over in the lounge room only to find everything as you left it and nothing there. One night I heard the footsteps coming down the hallway again only upon reaching the point where my bed met the hallway and started walking up the wall and walking on the roof, across my room, down the opposite wall and stopped behind a candle that I had lit in that exact spot, and I saw her shadow on the wall. A floating silhouette of specter with long hair, arms, and hands, and it tapered off at the waist. That was one of the most horrifyingly perplexing things I have ever seen. There's an endless litany to this ghostly gaslighting, and none of us had mentioned any of it out loud until one night my sister woke up screaming and swearing something was strangling her. After that realization that we were not each just ducking hearing things, the activity became unbearable. We could not sleep one more night in that house, but it would be about 3 more months to break the lease and not lose the deposit. In the past, my family scoffed at the idea of something like this being possible, so I was quite pleased, and also horrified, to be so vilified. The things I heard and saw in that house were some of the coolest, creepiest, and strangest shit I've ever experienced. I would have been no more than 13 when this happened. I was visiting my home country with my family for my aunt's wedding. Now mind you, we were all staying in my childhood home, which was known to be haunted. A lot of other things, that make my blood run cold to this day, happened there throughout the time I lived there, but that's a whole other story. So I was 13, as I mentioned, and I was an easily frightened child. Darkness was not my friend, and the house itself gave me creeps even in daylight. We were all sleeping in the big hall when the power outage woke me up. I was drowsy with sleep and extremely agitated because of the heat. It was a brutal summer. My Nana suggested that I go sleep in the room upstairs with the big window. It was one of the cooler rooms in the house, and it was where my aunts used to sleep. Now I have absolutely no idea how I even agreed to that, because it was pitch black and I don't like wandering the house alone, let alone in the dark. However, I guess I was too sleepy to care because I made the trip to that room all on my own in pitch darkness. So I get there, and I see that my aunt, the bride, is already asleep on the floor and the other one is on the bed. So I take a pillow and lay down on the ground beside her, the bride. In the next few moments, whenever I'd close my eyes, I'd feel something in front of my face, like, I don't know, a cloud of darkness. It would disappear whenever I opened my eyes. This went on for a few long moments, and I dozed off pretty quickly after that, paying that creepy situation no mind at all. When I woke up, a very faint blue light from the sky illuminated the room. It was still very dark, save for that blue light, and I unconsciously turned my head to my left and saw a dark figure kneeling beside me. Let me tell you guys. It was freaky as duck, I damn near pissed my pants. It was so tall, like so damn tall. And it sat so close to me, like one would sit on a prayer mat on their knees. From what I can remember, it seemed to be wearing some sort of long black cloth over its head that covered the rest of its body, and the eyes were white. White as duck. My voice literally forsook me. And then I screamed. So hard, I thought it was going to tear my voice box. I grabbed at my aunt that lay clueless beside me and hugged her, shoving my head into her neck. Everyone gathered into the room. And I told everyone what I'd seen. My grandma and mom said a prayer for me, and the rest of them were freaked out. Needless to say, I was not allowed to enter that room after that by my grandpa. As a child, I had horrendous night terrors. Like screaming bloody murder in the middle of the night, not able to calm me down night terrors. At least that's what the doctor told my mom. I stopped having them when we moved to a different house when I was 5. I don't remember a lot of my childhood, but I remember being terrified all the damn time in that first house. Things would move. You'd walk out of the kitchen for a few minutes and return to the cupboard being open. The TV would turn on in the middle of the night, full volume. You would hear pounding footsteps running up the stairs in the middle of the night. I was absolutely terrified of the cellar. It was an old house with a dirt cellar. I wouldn't even go close to the door. My uncle owned this house and let my family live there. Prior to my uncle owning it, an elderly couple had lived there for 40 plus years. The man was a real asshole, and my dad and uncles apparently liked to pull pranks on him. I found out later in life that he had died in the yard. I legit think he's still there. My uncle sold the house to my cousin. She tells me there's nothing in that house, but her daughter also developed night terrors after they moved in. The house we moved to was a very old farmhouse. The original part of the house was over 100 years old. There were things in that house as well, but they didn't feel as malevolent. I woke up often in the middle of the night to a young man sitting in the chair next to my bed or standing in my doorway, dressed in what I can only describe as Western banker attire, slacks, a white long-sleeve undershirt, and a fitted vest. I was afraid, but not terrified. I never told anyone in my family about this until my sister described the exact same thing when we were in our teens. My parents did a lot of renovating in that house. After they tore up all that ugly shag carpeting to reveal original wood floors, I would occasionally hear what sounded like a ball bouncing on the floor. My sister swears that she also saw a little girl and an elderly lady. You always had the feeling that you weren't alone or that someone was watching. Our dogs would sit at the bottom of the stairs, looking up, and would growl or bark at seemingly nothing. When I was 22, I was staying with my parents for a while, and my sister was home for the weekend to visit. A week prior to this, I woke up in the middle of the night at 2:13 unable to move. I felt like a huge weight was on my chest, and I could smell smoke. I've read about sleep paralysis, and I figured that was most likely what it was, though I had never experienced anything quite like that before. Fast forward a week when my sister is here, and I wake up at 2:13 to my dad screaming that the house is on fire. My sister had still been awake, downstairs in the living room, reading a book when she smelled the smoke. By the time I got up and downstairs, the entire connected garage was in flames. There were only 2 smoke alarms in the house, and neither worked that night. If my sister hadn't been there, it could have been so much worse. It still creeps me out to this day to think about my sleep paralysis or whatever the hell it was. The house was a total loss. It burned completely to the ground. Here's mine. Shortly after I was born in 1978, my parents decided to move out of NYC to the suburbs. They figured this would be a better place to raise children. They bought a house in Syosset, New York. The split-level house had 3 bedrooms, a living room, a dining room, a separate kitchen, and a den, which included a fireplace. In addition, there was a partly finished basement with a guest room, a billiard room, and a bar. The unfinished part of the basement included a boiler room/heater and the laundry room, as well as a toilet. We lived in this house until 1986, when my parents realized that living in the city might be better after all. Both my parents, in particular my mother, were deeply unhappy there. I remember my parents fighting and my mother crying. This may be that we were an ethnically diverse family in a largely white, conservative, petty bourgeois town. We always felt like outsiders there. As early as I can remember, I was terrified of the basement. The area by the bar had a particularly dark, ominous feeling to it. I was also terrified of the main level of the house at night and would rarely leave my room after being put to bed. I realized this could be chalked up to being a young boy, and I'm certainly not convinced that this was something paranormal, but I'll recount some of my stories as well as those of my family members. Most of the stories of my family members were disclosed years after we moved from the house, over Christmas dinner, when the wine had made my mother, my father, and my sister willing to share their own experiences. The earliest memory that I have in my room was waking up to the sound of cackling laughter, like that of a witch. The laughter stopped shortly after I woke up. I clearly remember hearing it and was petrified, frozen stiff. I was so scared, I didn't get out of bed and run to my parents' room. I stayed completely still until I assumed I fell asleep again. Of course this could have been a hypnagogic/hypnopompic hallucination, but it felt so very real. My mother would avoid going down to the basement to do the laundry alone. When she was down there, she felt something sinister and menacing watching her, eventually coming up behind her, as if breathing down her neck. I remember several times hearing her race up the stairs and slam the door to the basement shut. She always claimed that something chased her up those stairs, indeed, a common feeling people have in basements, haunted or not. My father said that when he was home alone, he would hear the BR balls, grouped in a triangle formation, break, as if someone were starting a game. He did not go down to investigate alone. When my mother came home, he made up an excuse to go down together, and the table and balls were untouched. There was a hamper/chute that connected the bathroom on the ground floor with the laundry room in the basement. This saved you the trouble of lugging laundry downstairs. You would take your dirty clothes, throw them down the chute, and they would fall and land on the laundry room floor. Whenever I opened the chute door, you could glide down to the basement. In my mind's eye, there was always a face looking up, menacingly grinning, taking pleasure in frightening a child. Every time you opened that chute to throw your clothes down, it was as if this thing was waiting for you and staring up. When I disclosed this story to my family over Christmas, some 20 years later, my sister's eyes got wide, and she said, "You felt it too?" My parents wouldn't go into detail, but they had the impression that something awful had happened in the basement, most likely a suicide. My sister and I pressed them for more information, but they refused and played down anything supernatural. After we moved out in 1986, my parents initially had trouble selling the house. We'd go back to check on it from time to time, rake the leaves, clean out the gutters, etc. The empty house had an even worse feeling. You couldn't close up and get out of there fast enough. Every time we drove away, there was a sense of relief. The house just felt terrible. I realize all of this is circumstantial and most probably not paranormal, so take it as you will. Thanks for letting me share this. I have two that I'll share. Story 1. I was about 18 years old, and this was during summertime in Texas. I was living in a little house by myself on my parents' property, and it was about 2 a.m., playing video games. Suddenly I heard a knock on the door, and it wasn't a gentle knock, it was a little loud. I stood up kind of spooked because I didn't have many friends, much less any that would come at that hour, and especially so aggressively. I stood there in the middle of my room past midnight and asked, "Who's there?" The doorknob jiggled, but there was no answer. I was trying not to panic. Again, I asked, "Who is it?" No answer, more knocks, "Who's there?" I yelled. Louder knocks, and the doorknob jiggles more aggressively, but there is still no answer. At this point I'm freaked the duck out. No one I know would come and mess with me like this at 2 a.m. I didn't have a cell phone at the time, but I had a landline, so I used my home phone to call my dad's cell and hoped like hell that he'd answer. He did, and I quickly explained everything. He ran to the back door of their house adjacent to my front door and confirmed no one was there. It suddenly quieted down as soon as I called my dad, and it didn't happen again for the rest of the night. I asked that my dad keep his cell phone loud for the rest of the night and keep an ear out for it just in case, but I was scared to death and also curious. I couldn't wait to wake up in the morning and ask everyone I knew if it was them, but everyone I asked said it definitely wasn't them. Still creeps me out to this day. Story 2. I was having some drinks with my folks late at night, and as usual, I got very hungry once the beer was done. It was about 1 a.m., and so I decided to walk to the burger joint a few blocks down from my house. My parents were always a bit protective of me, so they naturally warned against it and asked that I eat at home, but I was way too hungry and only a burger would satisfy. I assured them I'd be okay and drunkenly made my way over to the burger joint alone at a little past midnight. I got there, and it was closed. Sucked. Oh well. So I made my way home a bit annoyed and hungry, and just before I reached my house, literally just a few feet away, a car stopped next to me in a very dead street. A man in the car yelled out to me, "Have you seen my cell phone?" I was weirded out but just replied no. He asked if I was sure, and I said no again. He responded, "I can't find it, you think you can help me look for it?" And gestured for me to help him by getting into his car. "No, sorry," I responded and started walking quickly. He then drove alongside me, but thankfully my house was right there, so as soon as I made it to my driveway, I booked it, and he sped off in his car. Needless to say, I learned my lesson not to go out alone late at night, no matter how bad my drunk munchies kick in. I have many, but I can't tell my life story, so I'll tell my favorite, but also probably the sad. 6 years ago now, my husband's father fell ill. I was a hairstylist at the time and had just cut my father-in-law's hair the day before. I said to my mill that he is not well. It took him 20 minutes to walk down a flight of stairs. Which was unusual. I did my job, said goodbyes, and mentioned to my husband when he got home from work that his dad seemed off. He should call him. I don't know if he did or not. The following day, the mill showed up after dinner time to inform us that my husband's father was in the hospital and had been since last night. He's completely delirious and struggling to breathe. I also have the unfortunate gift of just knowing things sometimes. Be it bad or good. After me and the husband came back home, I wasn't going to say what I knew I had just gotten, but he knows it when I get those intuitive moments. He asked. I said, your dad has cancer, he isn't coming out. He got so angry with me, which is perfectly reasonable. Hearing your wife rip away any hope would be a kick to the heart. I wouldn't have said it if he didn't ask. He knows I live by raw truth. He also knows that when I have one of my feelings, I'm rarely wrong. 3 grueling weeks later, he passed away. He had a massive tumor in his chest that was wreaking havoc. Anyway, now as to why this is my favorite story. On his final day, I excused myself when I knew he was close. He waited for only immediate family to remain. So I got home and was just sitting with our pets in the quiet. Maybe 15 minutes passed and I heard someone open the door, so I looked over and my father-in-law walked down the stairs. Smiled at me, said hey kid, which is what he always calls me, and disappeared. About 30 seconds later, my husband called to tell me his dad had passed. I haven't seen him that vivid again, but I see him almost every day. His ashes are also in our house. One night, I was driving the car with my friend in the passenger seat. We were driving on back roads while listening to music. There was nobody else around, and the stretch we were in was without streetlights. Out of nowhere, 2 blaring lights shined in the rearview mirror. I swear, I looked in the mirror and saw a car right behind me. Since nobody had been around just seconds ago, I assumed the car must be driving pretty fast. So I floored it. I braced myself for impact. A second later, when nothing happened, I looked back at the rearview mirror. There was nothing but the faint red from my own taillights. I slowed and told my friend what I just saw. She admitted that she did not see any such lights. She did, however, get a creepy feeling and shivered just moments before I saw it. The cherry on top? The road we were on is one that my driver's education instructor had me drive on 16 long years ago. On that same stretch of road, he was telling me a story about some teen who was driving recklessly and drunk on that street. He went on describing the kid and how he went driving along with his buddies, up until we came to a slight curve and he pointed to a memorial cross on the side of the road. And that's where he crashed. My skeptical brain wants to chalk these headlights up to a hallucination, but I've never had a visual hallucination before. It's been years since this event occurred, and this most plausible explanation still doesn't make sense. The one and only time in my 32 years that I've ever had a hallucination just happened to be when my friend got the shutters as we were driving down this same road. I mean, I think that's still more likely than ghosts, but this was the one thing I've experienced that I really can't figure out. I was a skeptic until I spent a few nights in my wife's childhood home. For as long as I've known my wife, she's mentioned growing up in a haunted house. I always assumed she was joking because she always brought it up in quite a light-hearted way and never went into much detail. It was a big old house, and I figured she was talking about weird old house noises. The house belonged to her maternal aunt, who raised my wife for most of her childhood. Her great-aunt recently passed away, and her great-aunt's daughter, who my wife calls her aunt, though technically she's her second cousin or something, I'll be referring to her as her aunt, now owns the house. After my wife's great-aunt passed, we went to stay in the house for 4 nights to attend the funeral and spend time with my wife's family, as we live in another state. When we got there, my wife and her aunt were chatting and mentioned that they thought my wife's great-aunt might join the ghosts already haunting the house. I still didn't consider that they might be serious. The first night we spent there, I woke up in the middle of the night and noticed someone standing in the corner of the room beside the door. Thinking it was my wife, I asked what she was doing. This woke up my wife, who was actually sleeping beside me. I said I thought I saw someone in the room with us, but it must just be my eyes playing tricks on me. She asked, the person in the corner next to the door? Yeah, don't worry about it. I almost pissed myself. I thought there was some creep in the room, and my wife was too sleepy to process it. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but when my phone lit up the room I saw there was no one there. There wasn't even a weird shape that I might have mistaken for a person. The door was closed, so it wasn't like there could have been someone there who left the room in the moments I was looking away to grab my phone. My wife told me it was common to see shadowy people in the night, but I shouldn't worry because they don't do anything. She fell back asleep right after that, but I just lay there awake the whole night, wondering what the hell had just happened. The next morning I asked my wife about it, and she said she wasn't kidding about the house being haunted. People who spend the night in the house regularly see and hear ghosts, but they've never hurt anyone or caused any problems. I remained skeptical even after the next night, which had been after the funeral, and my wife and aunt both reported they'd been visited in their dreams by my wife's great aunt. So far, in my mind, everything was weird but explainable. The figure in the room could have been a strange trick of the light. My wife and her aunt had just attended the funeral of their loved one, and it made sense for them to both dream about her that night. The third night, I was kept awake for hours by the constant sound of footsteps pacing around the house. My wife also heard them, but said it was normal and I shouldn't worry, and she fell asleep easily. A few times during the night I got up to look around for the source of the noise. I even did a couple of laps of the outside of the house in case there was someone outside. I never saw anyone walking around. At one point I was in the lounge room and heard footsteps from the kitchen and called out to ask if there was anyone there. My wife's aunt opened her bedroom door and said she could hear the footsteps too, and just like my wife, she told me it was normal and there was no cause for concern. Then there was the sound of a drawer opening in the kitchen, which we both reacted to, and I went to check and found the cutlery drawer open. My wife's aunt, who'd come to the kitchen too, simply closed the drawer, commented with mild annoyance that the ghosts are always leaving things open, and went back to bed, leaving me to my existential crisis. I could not come up with a way to explain that away. We'd both heard the footsteps, both heard the drawer open at the same time, and there was no one there and no way out of the kitchen except for us. I tried staying on the couch to try and catch the mystery walker, and there were multiple times I heard the footsteps pass through the lounge room, but I never saw anything. Eventually I gave up and went back to bed. Nothing really happened the final night, though we woke up to several cabinets open and no one remembered leaving them open, though that could be explainable by someone just forgetting or even sleepwalking. Even so, the footsteps still bothered me, and the shadowy person from the first night and cabinets opened on the final night made me nervous in light of everything that happened on the third night. Up until now I've always scoffed at the idea of the paranormal, but I just can't reconcile my experiences in that house with my skepticism. Talking to my wife's family revealed that everyone who has stayed in the house believes it's haunted because they've had at least one completely unexplainable experience there. They all report that the ghosts leave people alone for the most part, though some who lived there for a long time as children, including my wife and her aunt, have described meeting individuals they thought were probably ghosts and having positive, but strange, interactions with them. My grandmother recounted a dream in which a woman with long black hair was strangling her. When she woke up, she was holding several long black hairs. No one in the house had hair past their chin, and none of it was black. I had one where I was camping on a college class trip and we were in an empty New England campground in late fall. It was all very Blair Witch and creepy, but the night was uneventful. We're getting ready to go the next morning, and I ran to the bathrooms while the vans were being loaded. I was in a stall, and someone came in and got into the stall next to me. I was tired and a bit irritated because there were a bunch of open stalls, and I don't like people in the one next to me, so when I finished, I glanced under the door to see whose shoes they were since we were literally the only people on site and there wasn't a damn thing there. I had heard the door, the footsteps, and the lock of the stall door rattling into place, and there was no one else in the room with me. I hightailed it out of there and got the hell on the van. Scared me all the more with it being a sunny morning without an ounce of creepy to prime me to hear things. I was never a believer in the paranormal. Until a damn near shocking encounter. After that, I'm a believer. Okay, let's get started. My school will participate in a joint exercise with other schools. Each school would send 10 boys. As a training exercise, camp with soldiers in a forest. Learn basic survival techniques. On the first day, we set up our tents and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, we heard a laughing sound/girl crying sound. We all woke up, but we heard our commanding sergeant. He told us to lay low, don't move, and just keep quiet till the sound stops. When we are lying down, sure as hell we can hear where the sound is coming from, and basically it is coming from above our tent. Well, I tried to brush it away, thinking it's not possible, it might be a monkey or something. So the next day it's as usual, nothing going on. Everything's going well till the sergeant started punishing anyone who smokes and started asking them to do push-ups and jump. Which I hated, so me and a couple of my buddies sneaked out. Right beside our location, there's an abandoned swimming pool that had toilet rooms. And for whatever reason, there was a dude in front of me within 1 foot who was walking in the same direction as me, heading to the toilet. I can specifically say he was wearing a green t-shirt and jeans with slippers and a long-haired dude. We identically went in the toilet together with me behind him. With just a turn, he was ducking gone. I suddenly felt panicked, so I searched the whole toilet, which is like maybe 500 square feet, because there's no window or other door to escape. My friends arrived while I was searching around the cubicle. They asked me what was going on. I told them there was a ducking dude in front of me. When I arrived, he was gone. They started laughing because they thought I was joking or trying to scare them. So they brush it off and start lighting their cigarette, and they helped me light mine too because I felt something suck out my energy till I can't even light my own cigarette. My whole body was trembling, I can't even smoke. After that, I felt something zap me around my neck like an electric. Weird feeling I don't know how to describe. Suddenly, I lay on the floor, feeling as though I was half passed out. 2 of my friends have to carry me back to the camp, because both of my legs are paralyzed. Going to visit my grandfather's grave when I was in my mid-20s. My grandfather was buried in a really old graveyard where the oldest graves were in the center, like before Civil War times. It was really in the boonies, so it's like middle of nowhere with an old church-type graveyard. Anyway, you have to walk the graveyard, and my grandfather is buried way in the back, so I hike up and say a few things and enjoy the quiet for a while, then start back down and detour a bit to look at some of the old gravestones. There is this one particular huge gravestone in the exact center, just massive compared to the others, which looks like a giant cut of rock was stood on end and the markings were simply chiseled in. It also is the only graveyard with an old iron fence around the plot, so it is really overgrown in comparison to the well-maintained plots. So I amble over and look at this and try to read it, but the grass is really blocking the dates, so I lean over the fence to brush aside and look for details. And just as I read 1790, something well rattles right next to my ear. Immediately, I think rattlesnake and jerk up. And as I do, something pushed me back hard. I actually skidded back about 3 feet and landed on my butt. I kind of freaked out a bit, looking around and trying to figure out what the hell happened. I looked down at the base of the grave, trying to see if I saw a snake or something, and then blinked because something was wrong. I couldn't figure it out at once. Then sort of shuddered and then really looked. And there was something causing the air to blur in front of me when I looked at the grave, but it had edges so everything was clear around it. I suddenly broke out in a cold sweat and butt scooted back so fast I hit my tailbone on a gravestone. I jumped up and half ran down the hill to the bridge to the parking lot and stopped right when I got to it to calm a bit. And then, I turned around and looked up. And I saw the blur moving down the hill between the goddamn stones toward me, and it was vaguely human-shaped. I could literally see the ducking movement as details went blurry and refocused as it moved. It wasn't fast, but it was coming. That was it. I tore my ass across the bridge, jumped in my car, and burned rubber out of the lot. It's been nearly 20-something years since that time, and even typing this has got me jittery. Just thinking about seeing the world blurred without any reason to it. And it's moving toward you. Christ. The devil's footprints, sometimes referred to as the devil's hoof marks, left tracks printed in the deep snow in the area of East and South Devon, England. On the night of February 8, 1855, the area was blanketed with snow from the heavy snowfall that occurred the night before. In fact, Britain was in the midst of the third coldest winter to be recorded. The snowy conditions were severe. As people went about their daily habits upon waking up that bitter morning, rumors concerning a line of unusual prints in the snow began to spread. In the snow were a long track of unusual, hoof-like prints that appeared to have been freshly made. The individual prints reportedly measured around 4 inches long and 3 inches wide. The prints appeared to have been made in a perfect, single-file line. Each print was spaced from 8 to 16 inches from each other. These tracks were unlike anything that the population of East and South Devon had ever seen. Townspeople noted immediately that these tracks weren't made by your common animal. Reports claim that the tracks meandered through the snow anywhere from 60 to 100 miles. Other reports addressed that the prints appeared to have been scorched into the snow, as if the snow had been branded by a hot iron. What made the phenomenon even more unusual was the route that the tracks followed. The tracks went over a 12-foot-high wall, over roofing, along narrow fencing, through barns, haystacks, gardens, courtyards, across frozen lakes, fields, and even more suspiciously, up to people's front doors. The mystery of the origin of the tracks would be widely publicized in the local newspapers. One newspaper article stated, "Since the recent snowstorms, some animals have left marks on the snow that have driven a great many inhabitants from their property and caused an uproar of commotion among the inhabitants in general. The markings, to say the least about them, are very singular. The footprint, if footprint it be, is about 3 inches long by 2 inches wide exactly, in shape, like a donkey's hoof. The length of the stride is about a foot apart, very regular, and is evidently done by some 2-footed animal. What renders the matter more difficult of solution is that gardens with walls 12 feet high have been trodden over without damage having been done to shrubs and walks. The animal must evidently have jumped over the walls." Townspeople began to speculate about what, or who, was leaving these tracks behind. Religious folk speculated that the tracks were caused by the devil himself, hence the name. On the other hand, more rational theories encompassed everything from hoaxes to the distorted tracks of mice, birds, rabbits, badgers, ponies, horses, and even escaped kangaroos. More unique theories included things like raindrops falling and creating distinctive depressions in the snow, or that a weather balloon had drifted downward and dragged across the ground. Still, nobody was able to accept one theory. There was no general consensus, And it appears to be the same case today. On March 5, 2009, there was a similar phenomenon that was reported in the same location. A resident named Jill Wade of Wolseley, North Devon, claimed to have discovered an unusual line of hoof-like tracks imprinted in the freshly fallen snow in her backyard. Wade reported that the tracks were approximately 5 inches long, with a stride between 11 and 17 inches. The tracks stretched for about 60 to 70 feet across the garden in an arch-like shape. The tracks started at her window, followed to the other side of her yard, and then disappeared. The tracks were closely examined by Graham Inglis, a biologist with the Center for Fortean Zoology. Inglis, who addressed their resemblance to the devil's footprints of 1855, could not positively identify the animal that made them. Inglis was also quick to denounce any conclusion of paranormal activity, saying, "This is certainly a first for me. The footprints are peculiar, but they are not the devil's. I don't believe the horned one has been in Wolseley. Personally, I think it belongs to a rabbit or hare, but quite an academic punch-up has started over it." Though the devil's footprints are most popularly known to have originated in Devon, there are more locations around the world that have reported hoof-like prints that were never conclusively identified as one animal. In 1945, near Everberg, Belgium, was another set of footprints that bewildered locals. On January 10, tracks were etched into the snow on a hill behind a place called the Château de Morveau. The prints, which resembled hoofs, measured 2.5 inches long by 1.5 inches wide. The tracks were composed of a series of 2 prints 9 inches apart that suddenly formed a perfect single-file line. The tracks were spaced between 12 and 15 inches apart and wandered for several miles throughout the country. Just as it had occurred in Devon, the tracks followed an abnormal route. The tracks walked miles across the hillside, forest, fields, and stream. The tracks also went over deep snowdrifts, but notably, there was no sign of an animal's body sinking or buried within the snow, just the tracks. More strangely, in May of 1840, 15 years before the tracks in Devon made their appearance, a similar phenomenon occurred on the remote Kerguelen Islands of the southern Indian Ocean. The frozen land is treeless and wholly surrounded by rough waters. The island is one of the most isolated locations in the world, as they are located more than 2,051 miles away from Madagascar Island, the nearest trace of civilization. The only plant life to be found on this island are some lichens, mosses, and grasses. The only animal life that inhabits the island are a few species of insects, seals, seabirds and penguins, feral rabbits, cats, and some sheep that have been introduced to the island by passing ships. Captain James Ross was on these shores as part of an expedition to catalog the island's plant and animal life. At that time, there were no introduced animals like there are today. In fact, the only animal life Ross would discover were insects, seabirds, and seals along the coast. While exploring the snow-swept land for any signs of life, there in the freshly fallen snow was a line of horseshoe-shaped, hoof-like tracks. Since there is a lack of animals that inhabit the island, these tracks made the discovery most unusual. It was speculated that a horse, pony, or donkey must have left their tracks imprinted in the snow from a previous expedition, or a horse had made its way there after surviving a shipwreck. However, considering that a horse would not have survived such Arctic conditions on its own, it must have arrived there fairly recently, especially given that there had been no signs of a shipwreck in the vicinity. However, members of the expedition noted that even these possibilities seemed improbable. While these situations are all similar, there is no way to tell if they are all related. The main question we face today is, what is forming these unusual, typically single-filed tracks? My aunt has a story of her and her siblings sharing the same experience while in 3 separate rooms. My aunt and I were driving in the town she went to school in. We drove past a house, and I remarked how awful it looked. She replied, "It is worse inside. That place is haunted." I had never heard my aunt talk of anything paranormal, and I haven't since. According to the story, the 3 of them rented out a somewhat sketchy house while they were attending school. Apparently, strange things would happen that made them feel uncomfortable, but never anything crazy. They would all notice that on a few occasions they would wake up in the night with the blankets off and at the foot of the bed. This is not unusual. People often remove blankets when they become too hot. One night, my aunt recounts that she had a dream she was falling and needed to grab onto something to save herself. She suddenly realized that she wasn't dreaming, and she was being pulled by her ankles out of her bed. She grabbed the rails of the headboard, and after a few horrifying moments, she got the strength to scream. At the same time, she hears screams from her siblings' rooms. As soon as the sensation began to fade, she hurried to check on them. They all had the same feeling of being pulled out of bed. Needless to say, they moved out and didn't look back. My buddy and I were riding home through the woods in Alabama. We were going down a rural patch of road on an old highway. We had been hunting that morning, and we didn't end up killing a deer, so we decided to fish and grab some food. The morning hunt felt strange, as if I were being watched in the woods. I'm a police officer and retired Marine, so I don't get spooked easily. A pack of wild dogs ran through where my stand was. I kept feeling that burning feeling of being watched. It prompted me to leave early. The dark woods of Alabama are a scary place. After the hunt, we fished at the pond for a while before returning home. On the way home, we ran into something I have struggled with since that day. It was exactly 12 noon when we saw it. Before I get into the incident, you need to know some history about Baldwin Company, Alabama. The Battle of Blackley was fought along this particular highway. This battle was a bloody onslaught that occurred at the end of the Civil War and resulted in immense casualties. Now, on to what happened. We were around mile marker 18, and to the right, there it was. On a grassy embankment, in a curve in a road, just past an old bridge that we passed stood a tall black horse with a rider wearing black armor. It had black gloves gripping his horn of the saddle with a sword sheathed. This dark rider was massive in figure and missing his head. You heard me right, a headless horseman. The horse was abnormally large and was darker than night. The rider stoically sat in his saddle, facing the road as if he were waiting on something as we drove past. Now I don't speak easily, and my buddy doesn't believe in that kind of thing. As we passed the horseman, time seemed to slow down as I sucked in every detail. I remember everything about it. My buddy also stared in disbelief as we seemed to glide past in the safety of the truck, like some sort of safari from hell. Now here is where it gets weird. So when we passed it, I looked back in the mirrors and poof. Just like that, it was gone. This area was rural, the horseman could not have come from anywhere or been headed anywhere that fast. My friend told me shortly after that he didn't want to speak about it again. He was shaken up about it. It wasn't until later that he accounted for his story, and we saw the same thing. All up until we passed the horseman. His account was that the horseman was on the left side of the road and slowly walked into the center of the road and disappeared. I saw him clear as day on the right side of the road. Has anyone else seen him? Please let me know. When I was a kid, we had a rocking chair in my room, that was super comfortable. I needed it in my room because I regularly had severe night terrors, and my parents would have to come and calm me down by rocking me to sleep in it. This got to the point where it happened nightly, and my parents clearly got drained from it, even though they said it was alright. One night, I woke up, presumably from a night terror, and instead of my parents being by my bed, this old woman who I've never seen, who very slightly glowed a soft green, was sitting in the rocking chair, rocking it. She was dressed in the very typical grandmother attire and specifically had a jade bead necklace. She gestured for me to join her, and although I was still a kid who literally just woke from a night terror, I wasn't afraid of her at all. I joined her, and she rocked the chair and hummed for a while. I am deaf, but I could feel the vibrations of the hum, and eventually I went back into my bed, and she would pull the bed covers over me. She kept appearing every night for quite a while, and it was the same routine. Although she would be wearing different clothes, she would always wear the jade necklace. Eventually my night terrors subsided, so I only sometimes saw the woman. Looking back, I realize how weird it must have been for my parents, because I was at one point waking them every night because of my night terrors, then suddenly one night I stopped needing them at all. So one night, my parents came in when I was in the middle of walking over to the rocking chair with the old woman, and they asked what I was doing. And when I looked back at the rocking chair, there was no one there. She appeared a couple times following that, but for the most part my night terrors completely stopped, so she stopped showing up. Fast forward to when I was 18 and my parents were showing me old photos of my family. Then I spotted a photo that had the rocking chair. I was shocked to see that the old woman was in the photograph, on the rocking chair. It turns out the rocking chair was from my grandma's grandma, who was the woman in the photo. But what freaked me out was when I was told she always wore this necklace of jade beads, would usually be found on the rocking chair, and was reportedly very motherly. While I don't generally believe in the supernatural, I can't deny the fact that there was no way I could have seen her before and imagined her exactly as she looked, including the details about her jade necklace. This all happened a few months ago. My friend had heard that the northern lights might be visible in our area and asked if I wanted to go for a drive out into the country to see if we could catch a glimpse. So we headed out after dark and drove for a while, putting the city behind us and winding out into the countryside, all while scanning the skies and searching for a good vantage point where the stars and the lights might be visible. But several hours passed, and with nothing to show for our efforts, we started to give up on seeing the lights altogether. As we discussed what to do next at that point, my friend noted that we were close to her hometown and reminded me that she had been wanting to visit the local cemetery to find the graves of some of her distant relatives. She had recently been researching her genealogy. It was a clear, warm night, and we were both pretty disappointed that we hadn't seen the lights. We both wanted to make the trip worthwhile, so we agreed to swing by the cemetery. We pulled into the dirt road adjacent to the cemetery and walked around until we found the right graves. She took some photos, and we decided to just wander around for a little while. My friend was leading the way, using the flashlight on her phone to light the path and to ensure that we didn't accidentally step on any of the graves. I had been feeling increasingly anxious since we arrived, which struck me as a bit odd. I have done several cemetery restoration projects as an archaeologist and don't normally feel nervous in cemeteries, even at night. In fact, I usually find that cemeteries are pretty peaceful and calming. However, I felt really strange in that particular graveyard and found myself frequently spinning around because I felt like someone was standing behind me. Still, I just chalked it up to general anxiety and tried not to dwell on it. One of the problems with having an anxiety disorder is that it's sometimes hard to tell when your nervousness is justified. Even in retrospect, I don't know if my anxiety was just in my head or if it was related to what would happen next. After wandering for a while, we realized that it was approaching 1 a.m. and that we should probably get back home. We turned back and headed toward the car. My friend's car was in sight, and she was a few yards ahead of me when it happened. I suddenly got a wave of that nervous feeling again and thought that I heard someone running up behind me. I was starting to turn my head to look back when I felt something collide with my back, the initial impact hitting me right between my shoulder blades. There was a substantial weight behind it, as if someone had actually hurtled into me. The impact was so forceful that I was thrown forward and fell flat on my face, and as I scrambled to get back up, I felt the weight pressing into my shoulders again and was shoved back down. I then glanced up to see my friend running toward me. She had also heard someone running up to us, had heard my initial fall, and had turned just in time to see me being pushed back down. She would later tell me that she had seen my sweatshirt flattening against my back and shifting, as if someone had been pressing their hands against my shoulders. She grabbed my arm to pull me up just as the weight disappeared, and we both bolted to the car, jumping in and instinctively locking the doors. She wasted no time starting the engine and then hastily peeled out of the driveway. As soon as we hit the main road, we just sped away from there as quickly as possible. We drove for several minutes without saying a word. I think we were both stunned and, more than anything, confused. She finally glanced at me and said, "What the hell just happened?" I didn't quite know how to answer that. I told her that someone had shoved me to the ground, and she said, "I know. I saw. But what was that? There was nothing there." We tried to come up with a rational explanation, but none of them made any sense. Had someone ambushed me and then bolted? Definitely not. We should have seen them. Had I tripped? No, I had definitely felt something pushing me, and my friend had seen me being shoved back down. Had it been the wind? Not possible. There hadn't been so much as a breeze that night, and if there had been some freak gust of wind, it would have hit my friend, too. Perhaps an animal had attacked me? But that didn't seem possible, either. There were no local animals large enough, strong enough, and stealthy enough to topple a full-grown human without being seen. I had been in full view of my friend, illuminated by her flashlight, during the second fall, and the weight had remained on my shoulders even as she was coming right up to me. She should have been able to see whatever had been pushing me. If nothing else, an animal would have cast visible shadows beneath the glare of her flashlight, but there was nothing. We just couldn't explain it. Whatever had pushed me, twice, it hadn't been visible to us. As the adrenaline faded, I noticed something else. My back hurt. Right between my shoulder blades, precisely where I had felt the impact, I could feel a sort of stinging, prickly sensation. It felt like my back, despite being covered by my sweatshirt, had somehow been brushed with stinging nettles. I mentioned this to my friend, and she insisted on pulling to the side of the road to look at my back. She switched the hood light on in the car and pulled the collar of my hoodie down to look. I heard her mutter, "What the duck?" She snapped a photo of my back and showed it to me. The skin between my shoulder blades was reddened, and several little blisters had started to appear. In the days that followed, the blisters would eventually swell up and pop. It was as if I had somehow gotten a sunburn or a severe chemical burn. There weren't any scratches or cuts, there were no open wounds, no blood. It was a relatively subtle mark, but it was still clearly there. And it baffled us. We certainly couldn't figure out how I'd gotten burned. I hadn't rubbed up against anything, I hadn't touched my back. I'd been wearing my hoodie all night, and there were no tears or marks in the fabric. And the burn hurt. It continued to sting for several days. I couldn't sleep that night. My back hurt, and every time I started to drift off, I'd suddenly begin to fear that someone was standing over my shoulder, and I would startle awake. I couldn't really understand what had happened at the cemetery, but it truly rattled me. I don't exactly know where I stand on the issue of paranormal phenomena, to be honest. As an anthropologist, I'm trained to keep an open mind, but I still have to rely on a deeply academic, and often empirical, perspective. Still, I know that something truly bizarre and frightening happened that night, and my inability to explain it and to account for every strange little detail has been deeply disturbing. It's also been especially difficult to grapple with this because I already have PTSD from a previous assault, and there is something profoundly unsettling about the fact that, in this instance, there is nothing I could have done to defend myself, and with no clear explanation for it, there is no way for me to prevent something like this from happening again. I cannot cope with a fear that I cannot even begin to understand. It's also begun to affect my dreams. I've had several odd nightmares since the incident in the cemetery, dreams that are oddly similar to the nightmares that I'd had for years when I was growing up. I don't know where they came from, but for as long as I can remember, I've had dreams in which a creature is attempting to lure me in one way or another, and in the dreams I usually understand this creature to be a devil or a demon. Simply put, sometimes evil. Something dangerous and, like the entity in the graveyard, difficult to understand. These dreams have become suddenly relevant again, as I seem to have them nearly every time I fall asleep these days. I know that these are likely due to trauma, hopefully not due to anything more sinister. These dreams and the experience in the graveyard are somehow linked. Sometimes the menacing creature in my dreams transforms into an old woman. I had one dream when I was about 13 years old in which I was wandering through a forest. I came across a little cottage with this old woman standing by the porch. She beckoned me inside, and I accepted. We spent some time casually talking and baking cookies, but I felt uneasy around her and got the sense that she wanted something from me. We stayed only in the kitchen throughout the dream, but I can recall glancing at the doorways to other rooms and seeing nothing but shadowy edges. I thought that perhaps I should try to leave, but I couldn't remember how to find my way out. At one point, as we sat at the kitchen table, I glanced out the window and noticed a group of people standing in the yard, calling out to the old woman. I asked who these people were, and she told me, "They want me to take them in, but I don't want them. I want you." In other dreams, it has had a more sinister appearance, but I always recognize it as the same creature. I sometimes have dreams in which it is sitting in the dark at my bedside, whispering to me. It has a shadowy appearance with long, lanky limbs and empty eye sockets. Its teeth are made of razor wire, and there is something like blood or wine gleaming on its lips. In those dreams, I can hear it whispering but can't understand what it's saying. Sometimes I have dreams of the same creature sitting in a chair in the corner of my room, eating what seems to be a rotten apple. I have long suspected that this creature is some manifestation of my deepest and most troubling fears. I know these are just dreams, but I mention it because those dreams had subsided in my early 20s, but the incident at the cemetery rattled me so much that they've returned. It seems to have shaken my understanding of the world around me, opening the floodgates to my own inner demons. In these new dreams, that creature is standing upright behind me at the cemetery. Time seems to be slowing down. I can sense my friend frozen ahead of me, and the creature is whispering at my back. I don't really know why my mind is conflating that dream creature with my encounter at the cemetery, but the fear has increasingly kept me up at night. I have no idea what happened that night. My friend believes it was a ghost, but I just don't know. I've just never personally experienced anything like this. I really don't know what to do with it. Thanks for listening. When I was young, in grade school, I occasionally saw things. I'd say, "Why are those two men floating through the air in our living room?" And my stepmother was all nonchalant and asked about it and then acted like it was nothing strange at all. I imagined she didn't want to give me a reaction, the same as you don't respond to a swear word, as that actually encourages the behavior. And these were so few and far in between that it wasn't really a problem, just an odd occurrence. Shortly before I turned 18, an event happened that opened the door, so to speak. There's something that makes us generally filter out the other layer, the veil, the other side, whatever you want to call it. And my third eye was forced wide open because of this event. I'm sure it was naturally open a little before, seeing things like did happen to members of my family, but rarely and usually when it was a matter of life and death importance. But now I could see shadow people almost daily, shadow cats, voices that no one else could hear. It was scary, especially since the activity, banging on the walls and disembodied footsteps, happened when I was alone. It didn't happen around my family, so no one else saw it. The shadow people, apparitions, and departed relatives would be there sometimes when other people were around, but only I could see them. And because this was an almost daily occurrence that only I was experiencing, my family started thinking I was off my royal rocker. They told me not to talk about it. They especially told me not to tell other people about it. Other people would treat me badly, like I was crazy, and they didn't want that to happen. But I couldn't not talk about it. Things kept happening that were scaring me, I needed help. I think some people thought I was crazy. Others didn't seem to care. Still others were fascinated. Mind you, I didn't tell everyone, just people I really trusted. A few of them acted like they believed me and encouraged me to talk about it. I was later in a room playing video games, and they didn't see me and started sharing what I told them happened last, laughing back and forth as a sick sort of entertainment. It really hurts when someone you trust betrays you like that. So I stopped talking about it. To everyone. It was still scary, but I was learning how to resolve the situation. Learning what was really there, and in doing so, the major thing that scared me, not knowing what it was, made it less scary. Occasionally, I'd still say things to my family. When I would see a dead relative in the room that they all knew, I'd tell them she was there. I think it scared them a little, and just to be safe, they would talk to the dead relative, respectfully say hello, and tell them they loved them. Sometimes it was when they needed them. I think it felt good they could say the things they really needed to in those times. But afterward it always went back to don't talk to people like this. If it were real, then why can't I see it too? I can't tell you how many times they did experience things. My mother saw her dead grandfather. She told me when he appeared. Later, she tried to convince herself it never happened and eventually just tried to block it from her memory. There were several events like this. I'd think they were finally with me, then they'd later try to convince themselves it didn't happen and sometimes even fully forget it on the occasion someone else finally did experience something. Or maybe they just said this in hindsight so as to discourage my behavior. I don't know for sure. At this point it wasn't so bad, I was used to it, and I didn't talk to them about it much. Only when it seemed important for them to know these things were happening. Otherwise, I'd see it and just not tell anyone. And then, after a few years, things started to change. I moved out, but the activity continued. Whenever something happened, I was always the first to know. Because I'd understand and know what to do, I guess? None of it was ever malevolent. I'm pretty sure that one is long gone now. Usually it's just someone saying hi, and of course my family isn't used to activity happening. They even saw my dead great-grandmother. I think since their radio isn't as good as picking up a signal as mine, the spirits have to try a lot harder and put a lot more energy into being seen by them. My mother recently was at an accident scene in her car. She called me up panicked because she looked over and saw a bloody person outside her car that was there 1 minute and gone the next instant. She was freaked. But once we talked about it and assured her it was a normal part of life and death, she seemed okay. So to answer your question, I started out as isolated and alone. I had no support. Religion made things worse in many ways. But now I'm not only accepted for seeing these things, I'm the one people turn to when something strange happens, the one people turn to for support. I don't always know the answer. Just sometimes things seem to parallel with my experiences, and I can help that way. My wife, kids, and I currently live in my childhood home. It used to belong to my great-grandparents. We moved in when I was 12 and rented when they passed, and as an adult, I bought it from my grandparents after my parents moved on. Anyway, growing up here, I've definitely had some strange experiences. I slept in the basement for most of my teenage years. We were kept out of school as kids and didn't go out much. It was a kind of weird, lonely hell. I'd often get sleep paralysis. Some years it'd be every single night/morning, and see figures or hear people either speaking gibberish or calling my name. I learned to wiggle my toes to snap out of it and just accepted it. Ever since moving here, almost every dream I've had has been a terrible nightmare. Sometimes I wake up with a jolt from them and get a creeped out feeling that keeps me from going back to sleep. There's a lot of other stuff, but for the sake of not coming across as a complete schizo, I'll leave it at that for now. Before me, when my grandparents were still here, my great-uncle slept in the basement for years as well. He ended up committing suicide immediately after leaving. After him, my mother's cousin stayed in the basement. He died shortly after leaving. One of my few childhood memories of my great-grandfather, who owned the house, was him being scared to stay in the house alone overnight when my grandmother had to spend some time in the hospital. Everyone else that stayed here has commented that something is off about the place. My wife has lived here for roughly 10 years now and has had a lot of weird shit happen to her as well. She's going through a bit of a Christian phase, to put it lightly. Recently, she had a few of her church friends come to pray over the house. Without us telling them any details, one of them mentioned she thinks something's wrong with the basement. The thing that prompted me to share this was my daughters. We have 2 twin girls, now 4 years old. About a year ago, one of my daughters was eating a snack with me at the kitchen table. Out of nowhere, she started freaking out and jumped in my arms, burying her face in my chest and crying uncontrollably. She kept pointing to a corner of the kitchen, saying there's a bad girl there. I got her to calm down a bit, trying to convince her there's no one there. She was adamant there was someone there. Every time she looked back at the corner, she'd start freaking out again. I asked her what the girl looked like. She said mean, with blue skin. I asked her what she was doing. She said she was looking at me. I got chills and had a huge sense of dread. I took her out of the room and tried to pretend it was just her imagination, though it did freak me out a bit, to be honest. Lots of little things have happened since then, but I'm excellent at dismissing stuff. Now, a couple days ago my wife and kids got back pretty late from a friend's house. When they came inside, my other daughter was screaming in my wife's arms, totally inconsolable for a long time. I finally got her to tell me what was wrong. She said she heard really loud knocking and footsteps when they were parked in our driveway. My wife was in the car and didn't hear anything. She said there was a mean blue person standing in the neighbor's yard, a few feet away from the car, staring at her. No amount of talking to her can convince her she didn't see a mean blue guy staring at her. She's still scared to go out in the driveway, days later. I'm not sure what the point of sharing this here is other than just getting it off my chest and seeing if any of you have some input. For the record, I'm not a particularly spiritual person or anything. I was raised Christian and became an atheist around 12 years old. Now I'd say I'm agnostic. I'd like to believe none of this is real. If so, I've certainly done my share of opening doors and would feel a sense of guilt keeping my family here. So, am I schizo or what? 100% true story. Halloween night, 1983. A female friend and I, I'd been friend-zoned, but we were great friends, decide to watch The Exorcist at my parents' house while they were out of town. About 20 minutes into the movie, not much is even happening yet, but she starts getting kind of freaked out, so we pause the movie and just start chatting about scary stuff. I point out a portrait on the wall of a friend of my mother's who had actually been murdered some years earlier. Being the jerk I was, I tell Amy the story of the kinda creepy looking portrait and say, wouldn't it be weird if it fell off the wall tonight? Ha ha ha. We go back to watching the movie, and several minutes later the portrait falls off the wall. No joke. It just falls, with nothing and no one near it. She gets pretty freaked and leaves the room to go use the bathroom after stating she was too freaked by that to stay, and maybe I should take her home. When she returns, there are 2 steps down into the room. As she takes the first step, all the lights in the room go out. She screams, and I had to take her home. 20 minutes later I return home, and as I climb the stairs without turning on any lights, I'm suddenly viciously attacked by our enormous Irish wolfhound, an otherwise gentle and even timid dog, but she's snarling and biting at me as we tumble down the stairs together. Something made her very freaked out. I calmed her down and went to bed. Next morning, an inexplicable fire breaks out in the attic, which I extinguish with a fire extinguisher. Years later, retelling this story at a family dinner in the same house, my then fiancé says, I don't want to hear about it, I don't like ghosts. And, on perfect cue, all the lights in the dining room go out. To start, I'm a 19-year-old female, and at the time of this story, I was around 15. I want to make it clear that I am a very spiritual person and have had many encounters with the paranormal before, but this one was the most terrifying yet. Every year for work, my mother has a convention at a hotel that was built in the late 1700s. The place is massive and overall elegant. Since her work has been going there for years, our family gets a discount whenever we want to venture there for a vacation. This was my first time at the hotel, and I instantly loved it. With me were my father, brother, and, of course, my mother. When we first got into our room, there was just a dreading feeling whenever I entered my room alone, so I tried to only go in there with my brother. We had a lot of fun eating gourmet food, getting a spa treatment, and wandering around the hotel grounds. I was outside one day with my camera and decided to take a picture of the main building. As I was looking through the camera, I noticed tiny windows at the top of the building. Nothing unusual, just windows to the old maid's quarters, my mom said, but I still got a weird feeling from just looking at them, and it didn't help that most of the windows were broken or even open in the dead of winter. One night after dinner, my mother and I decided to walk around the interior of the hotel while my brother and dad rested in the room. It was around 8 p.m., and there were very few people, especially if you strayed away from the main entrance. We took our time walking around and looking at various rooms, including a movie theater that we both refused to enter. Before we headed to bed, we decided to go to the very top floor to look out some of the windows to get a better view of the town below. We entered the nearest elevator and pressed floor 16. As we were going up, my brother called to ask us where we were, and my mom and him started chatting. All of a sudden the elevator doors opened, and we were both frozen in place. The door opened, and we both got hit with an incredibly cold breeze, along with a pitch-black room. We both immediately pressed a different floor because we could sense that we weren't supposed to be there. I squeezed my eyes shut because I was terrified something was going to pop out at me. Suddenly the doors close and we both start to relax, but all of a sudden the numbers on the elevator display panel started going crazy. It was rapidly displaying 2 and then various other numbers, including those that weren't even listed as buttons on the elevator. I got so scared, and my mother and I were hanging on to each other in complete terror. By this time, my mother was off the phone with my brother, and we had no idea what was going on. All of a sudden the panel displays floor 15, and the doors open up. Not wanting to stay in the elevator, we decided to use the stairs. As we started making our way to the stairs, I started to feel a presence behind us. I let my mother know what I'm sensing, and she just told me to not look back and to walk as fast as possible. That statement freaked me out even more because my mother usually doesn't feel that kind of energy. As we are making our way down the stairs, I decide to look back, and what I see will stick with me forever. I saw a tall, black, mist-like shadow figure a few feet behind us. It didn't have any features and seemed to stand still. We kept running until we hit the main floor and we could finally breathe. We decided to look at the elevator to see if the floor we selected had an employees only sign, but it didn't. On our way back to our room, we figured out that we must have accidentally made our way up to the old maid's quarters, which sent chills up my spine. My mom also came to the conclusion that the cold air must have just been the winter air making its way through the broken/open windows. I agreed, but the cold air felt different from the crisp winter air from outside, but I could have just imagined that. When we got back to our room, my brother asked what happened, and we told him the whole story. All of a sudden he looked at us with a weirded out look on his face, and he told us that while on the phone with my mom when the elevator doors opened, he heard a bunch of whispers come through our end. This freaked me out so much, and I opted to sleep in my mother's room the rest of the trip. Nothing else happened during our vacation, and we left a few days later. My mom still has her convention there every year, and now that I'm employed with her, I go too. Whenever I go, I always experience things, but nothing that extreme. If you want to hear some other stories from my family's experiences at the hotel, please let me know. I would love to get them off my chest. Thank you for listening. Back in 2019, I was visiting my grandfather in Rhode Island. I was 18 years old at the time. He lives in East Greenwich, and his house is over 300 years old. Rhode Island is famous for its colonial-era houses and history, so it's not uncommon to find a really old house. On the first day of visiting him, a couple hours later, I ventured upstairs to explore the house. I've always been a curious soul, and I went into my uncle's bedroom. My uncle was at work, so I was alone in the room. I went in there because the attic was located in that room, and I wanted to see what was up there. There's a long hallway between my uncle's room and my grandfather's room, and my uncle's room was straight down. As soon as I pulled the ladder to the attic down, I heard the bedroom doorknob jiggling. It turned to the right, and the door suddenly opened halfway. I stopped what I was doing, and I walked up to the door, peeked around it, and I said, "Hello?" No response, and nobody was on the other side. I brushed it off, shut the door, and went back to what I was doing. Once again, as soon as my hand hit the ladder, the door opened on its own again. This time I heard a strange swoosh sound behind the door before it opened. I was freaked out, so I stepped out of the room and went back downstairs, where my family was. I told my family about this later on, and they believed me. My mother and my sister both had many paranormal encounters in that house when they lived in it during the 1990s. They actually saw full apparitions of a woman dressed in a black funeral dress and a veil, along with shadow figures. Thankfully, I did not stay in the house long enough to experience anything like that. As for my encounter, there was no draft in that house, and there were not any windows in the hallway, so I am completely certain that it wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was very creepy. And as a Roman Catholic, I am certain that it was demonic activity. I don't believe in earthbound spirits. When I was around 20, I had a strange fascination with ghosts. I read so much about it till it became more like an obsession. I was amazed by the concept of a soul lingering into this realm and haunting places with tragic backstories. Of course, the skeptic in me never fully believed in the concept. So I wanted to search for proof myself, so I decided to start visiting supposedly haunted houses with a friend. I started researching houses in Belgium and the Netherlands since these were close by. So we did a couple of them and got some scares, but nothing to give us some actual proof. The scared we got, we could easily link to the subconscious thoughts we had going into this expecting paranormal activity. So after the last one, I decided for myself that it was not real, and these experiences people have probably had some rational explanation for. So I forgot about the whole subject of ghosts and just put it behind me. I also want to point out that they were abandoned houses. A couple of years forward, me and two friends, one was the friend I explored these houses with, went on a road trip through Spain. We wanted to go by the sea lane all the way to Gibraltar and then back, going through the mainland of Spain to return to Belgium. So when we got to Gibraltar, the plan was to meet up with my stepdad and sister because my stepdad knew somebody who lived at the border of Gibraltar in Linea de Concepcion. So we met up and could all stay in this friend's apartment. Now my stepdad and all my friends were avid rock climbers except for me because I have a fear of heights. The plan was to go to this amazing place close to Malaga, which had these beautiful mountains and forests to climb and explore. So we are driving on the freeway on our way to this place. I'm sitting in the front passenger seat, and as we are driving, I see this very big and beautiful abandoned house located next to the freeway we are driving on. For some odd reason, I recognized this house. It was kind of surreal. It was like having a déjà vu. This was impossible because I never went to Spain. So my friend that is driving, the one that I visited houses with, I asked him, "Did you see that house?" But till I asked, we were too far so he could actually see it. Then it dawned on me, all those years back when I was researching haunted houses, this is the house I saw on one of the sites where they named it the most haunted house in Spain. In a second, my lost interest in haunted places sparked up again because this was one of the houses I really wanted to visit when I was obsessed with this topic. So I showed a picture to my friend, and he at first did not believe it was that same house, but after showing where it was on the freeway, we could determine it was the actual house we wanted to visit all those years ago. Both of us got kind of excited and wanted to go, but we were already en route to this beautiful place and could not make a detour because the second car, which had my sister, stepdad, and his friend in it, did not want to stop for some abandoned house. So we kind of put it in the back of our minds and just left it there. We arrived at the spot and camped there for the night. The day after we would return to the friend's place, so we packed up all of our stuff and went on the road again. The only difference was that my sister joined us in our car this time. She was quite young, around 14 or 15, and Judy wanted to go with us. Not thinking about the house, we are driving on the freeway, and lo and behold, there it was just almost staring at us. So me and my friend got so excited we decided to drive over there and go visit this house. The problem was that my sister was with us, and I did not want to subject her to abandoned houses because they can be quite dangerous. Once she heard the tale of being haunted, she really wanted to go with us because, for her, the idea was exciting. So after some back and forth, I decided she could join, but only if she held my hand the entire stay. So we kind of parked where not everyone could see us and sneaked into the house. The house was beautiful even though it was abandoned for a long time and was slowly but surely falling into pieces, but you could see in its heyday that this must have been a work of art. So we start going through the house. Me and my friend are so excited we are actually in this house, not even thinking about the haunted part of it. We go through some of the main rooms and see some drawn pentagrams on the wall, which we found somewhat amusing because this was probably the work of some kids seeking a thrill. We explored some more and enjoyed the experience. Things started to get weird when we decided to go upstairs. We go upstairs, and suddenly the air starts to feel heavier. Breathing started to get a bit harder for all three of us, but not so much that we started to panic. We looked in all the rooms that were on the second floor, and my friend started to take pictures of them. This one room felt a bit off, like you can't really explain it, but you could feel it. So my friend took 3 pictures of the room fast after each other. 2 pictures were of the room, but the last picture was almost entirely black, like something was in front of the camera. Me and my friend looked at each other and kind of smiled because it brought back that sensation of finding something haunted. My sister, who was holding my hand, still kind of found it funny, but you could see she kind of got a bit scared. So me and my friend stopped talking about it to ease her a bit. We kept walking and taking pictures. Now here it got a bit weirder. There was this room with a closed door, which was weird because most rooms didn't have any doors anymore. So we opened the door, and in front of us was a newly made altar that had all these candles and dark flowers lined up in half a circle with, in the middle, a dead bird. Here we kind of started getting a bit spooked out and a bit confused as to why this was there. My sister really started getting scared, so we went downstairs again and decided to just quickly go through the rest of the house and leave for my sister. We walked through it, and suddenly my sister screamed loudly and freaked out. I started asking, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And she screamed something passed by my leg the size of a dog. Of course there was no dog. She started crying and was terrified, so I took her, and we left the house and went back to the car. Me and my friend still wanted to see the courtyard in a hurry. I should explain the house is shaped like a U with in the middle a courtyard. So my sister stayed in the car, and we swiftly went to the courtyard. There we had a very nice view of the building that was practically surrounding us. On the courtyard, there was a hole in the ground with a ladder. My friend wanted to go in it, but I stopped him because who knows what's in there and it could be very dangerous. So we kind of looked in the hole, and you could see it was just a wall ahead, so we left and went back to my sister. We left the house so my sister could calm down, and we headed back to the friend's place, where we stayed. We came back, and the third friend who was on the road trip with us was already there because he went back from the rock climbing place with the other car that had my stepdad and his friend in it. When we came back, we told the story of this house and the experiences we had in it. My friend just started laughing at us because he was a total skeptic and did not believe in haunted places, and this was all in our heads, etc. My sister actually never spoke about it, because you could see she was still shook up from the experience she had with the thing going through her leg. So that day me, my friend, and the other friend who was skeptical, decided to leave in the evening to start our journey back through the mainland in Spain. We were in the car, and me and my friend just looked at each other in this weird excitement, and both knew. Let's go back to the house now that it's dark. In hindsight, this was not the best idea. So we asked the skeptical friend if he would be up for this. Again, he laughed and said, "Of course, I'll just walk in with you both and show these things are in your heads. As a skeptical, I will prove this." So we get back to the house, and this time it's dark, and it looks menacing as hell. Like we sat in the car, just looking at it made us kind of scared, but the excitement me and my friend had for the house being haunted just made us get out. The skeptic joined and still laughed at us. So we went in and wanted to explore, but the house was so dark and we did not have a flashlight. We decided it was too dangerous and just decided to go to the courtyard and just listen and watch the moonlight shine, giving us some light in the courtyard. Like I said, the house was U-shaped, so we are standing there with the moonlight shining on the courtyard while we are surrounded by this massive, eerie-looking house. Now at one of the corners of the roof there was a big tower. Kinda like a bell tower. So we were standing there, me and my friend, hoping something would happen, and the skeptic was just kind of laughing it off. Suddenly we hear a noise coming from the tower. It went, shh, shh. Imagine it as a sound between whispers and the sound of a broom going across the floor. We all went quiet as it continued and continued getting louder and louder. Shh, shh. We got kind of scared and excited. The skeptical friend said that's just a cat hissing or something. The sound continued, shh, shh. Then, in a split second, the sound went from the tower right next to our ears, giving an extremely loud, shh, directly in our ears. A flock of birds came flying out of the house. We felt things going past us and just ran out of that place as fast as we could back to the car. We all stood at the car, so frightened of what happened. We turned around and looked back to the house, and you could see these massive lights on the wall of the house. Needless to say, we hopped in the car and drove off terrified. We all looked at each other, wondering what that was. The skeptic friend looked in shock at what happened. We were all in shock. That sound is something we will never forget. This sound traveled 20 meters from a tower right next to our ear in a split second. To this day, we don't talk about it that much. After the visit, I started having these awful nightmares of my friends killing people in the most brutal ways. I got up and started researching the house, and that's when my mouth dropped to the floor. Here is what I read. It is known in Malaga as the Haunted Mansion, not only for its ghostly appearance but also due to numerous reports of mysterious voices and strange sounds that have been reportedly heard there without explanation. It is among the best-known haunted buildings in Spain and is considered a sort of temple by followers of paranormal phenomena. Legend has it that the Heredia family, together with other rich families in the area, kidnapped young girls, aged between 18 and 21, and subjected them to sinister satanic rituals, involving torture and murder. The bodies of their victims are said to be buried deep within the property. While it is true that many young girls did disappear during this period, nothing was ever proven to connect their disappearance to the Heredia family. Many say they used their money and influence to evade justice. Whatever the truth of the matter, paranormal enthusiasts maintain that the pain and suffering that took place within those grim walls has led to inexplicable ghostly phenomena. We all sat there, just looking at each other in awe. We later found out the hole we saw in the courtyard with the ladder. It used to be the entrance to underground tunnels, which allegedly had torture chambers where they kept these young women. They cemented it shut when that family was not there anymore. Hence the wall we saw. To this day, it's one of the most terrifying experiences I ever had. I never looked up haunted houses again in my life.